Hello everybody and welcome to Drydock episode 395 part 2, or part B, whatever I'm calling it these days, I honestly can't remember. Anyway, it's the second half of the Patreon Drydock, so plenty more questions to get on with, and let's get on with them. Fitch's 5th Fleet Fish Fleecer Fiercely Fishing for Fleeting Fish for 4 Fisher Fritter Flavour Favours asks, have there been any serious attempts to utilise alkali metals for naval propulsion purposes? So that would be lithium, sodium, potassium, rubidium, cesium, francium. As far as I'm aware, in the time period the channel covers, no. They're just far too reactive and unstable, for one thing. I mean, anyone who's thrown a lump of sodium into a bowl of water will know, yes, it'll go fizzing around sometimes, and sometimes it'll catch fire, and sometimes there'll be a pop because it's exploded, and usually all three of these things will happen at random intervals as it gradually burns away before it's all gone. So that's not really a reliable, consistent energy output, is it? And once you get higher than that, things get progressively more explosive. Now, I am vaguely aware that some nuclear reactors in the post-channel period have used, I think, was it liquid sodium as a coolant, which technically is a form of propulsion, even if it's not obviously acting as the fuel. And I think, again, obviously my knowledge of nuclear reactors is not as extensive as my knowledge of oil-fired steam turbines, but I think there are some molten salt reactors that do use alkali metal-based salts like lithium salts, and that is actually a part of the fuels, but whether anyone sent a molten salt reactor to sea, I don't know, and obviously also well beyond the scope of the channel. Andrew Dederer asks, about when did the number of building ways or graving docks and their size become a choke point in ship construction? The US Navy was perfectly willing to leave ships on the stocks for years for the first half of the 19th century. Conversely, the limited number of building spots remaining in Britain post the mid-interwar slump seems to have been a major factor in limiting production speed, along with the shortage of cranes and electricians, and putting a lot of ships beyond economical repair in World War II. Well, the exact point and exactly why and how is obviously beyond the scope of a Drydock answer, probably subject of at least one, maybe more Wednesday videos at some point. But as a very crude outline, essentially the naval building infrastructure becomes a major choke point around about the time of significant mechanization of shipping. So essentially you're looking at the 1860s onwards with iron-hulled warships and steam power coming together. Now, there's a few reasons for that. Firstly, if you think about the classic age of sail, even up to the period when they're installing boilers and such in some ships of the line, while there's been a little bit of a jump in ship size since the 1810s with the Seppings and Simmons improvements and so forth, broadly speaking, over that expanse of time, while ships have gradually become somewhat larger, the very largest ships haven't really grown massively in that time. Something like Sovereign of the Seas, while she certainly wouldn't be the largest warship in the world in the Battle of Trafalgar, for instance, she'd still be a respectably sized combatant, which is not something you can say with that kind of time gap at any point going forward from that period. And so with relatively limited sizes of warship, you can fit more slipways, more docks, etc. within a similar footprint. And they're all being built with roughly the same technology. It's mostly wood, later on with a little bit of supplemental help from iron. And the construction of warships doesn't require all that much in terms of technology compared to, and I stress compared to, the latter part of the 19th century and onwards. It's still a hugely technological endeavour, but fundamentally, if you want to build a graving dock or a slipway for a wooden ship, you need either a hole in the ground that's waterproof or a compacted slope of earth, ideally with some brick or stone overlaying it. And that's really about it. The framework that supports the ship, the A-frame cranes that bring the bigger bits and pieces of the ship in, they can all be constructed on site on an as-needed basis. Now, obviously, if you have some fixed infrastructure, that does make it a bit easier, but it's not necessary. That makes it relatively easy to expand. If you're in the middle of war and you need tons and tons of ships, okay, fine. Well, a few hundred labourers and you can build more slipways, dig more dry docks, etc. relatively swiftly. Once you get into metal production, so iron ships and then later steel, ships expand massively in size. So now you each slipway or graving dock takes up a larger amount of space. They also weigh more, so those things need to be stronger to support them. They're physically larger, so you move on from just essentially knock together crane work to permanent cranes, and if the cranes are going to be mobile, like the rail mounted cranes that a lot of these places have, that means further infrastructures to support all of them. The components are also getting heavier, so the supply infrastructure is getting larger. And also as industrialization occurs, port cities and so forth are growing faster and faster, and they tend to grow around the dockyards, and that actually limits them in size and scope, because if you're in, I don't know, the 16th century, there's going to be fairly large undeveloped portions of land relatively close by to your original infrastructure. So you just go, okay, well, we'll just build over there. Whereas if you go to, say, 1880s, 1890s Portsmouth, and you look around, well, there's urbanization as far as the eye can see for several miles in both directions, which makes expanding the dockyard considerably more difficult. So suddenly the space that you have to upgrade your infrastructure has become less. At the same time, you actually need a larger infrastructure to build the ships that you want. So even if you do have the space, it takes considerably longer to establish these things, and it takes considerably more money to do so, because you have to build the railways, the extra load-bearing foundations, the cranes, the warehouses, etc., etc., etc. And of course, that also makes maintenance much more difficult because, yeah, as you said, in the early 19th century, if you don't have immediate use for a ship, then sure, leave it on the stocks, cover it with some tarp, check up on it occasionally, and that's pretty much all there is to it. Whereas if you leave your much more expensive equivalent slipway with a ship standing on it in the early 20th century, just the maintenance costs of keeping that thing operational and all the machinery associated with it are going to be quite high. Let alone, obviously, all the money you're missing out on not utilising that slipway. Whereas, as we said, back in the 19th century, if you did leave something on the slipway, you'd be like, well, we can use one of 16 others, and if absolute worst comes to worst, we'll just build another one. And from that point on, as ships get even larger very rapidly and even more technically complex, the infrastructure to support them likewise becomes larger and more complex, and even really large industrial powers are usually somewhat limited on what they can do and where. Now, there are a few exceptions to that, of course. For example, when it comes to the United States in World War II, the sheer amount of coastline that they have means that they, and combined with the wealth, means that they can build entire new slipways, entire new shipyards, and the towns to go with them, because they have the resources to do it and they have the land available to do it. Plus, not being consistently bombed and having your efforts disrupted also helps. Whereas in World War II in Britain, an awful lot of naval infrastructures I've covered in various dry docks before had been actually actively destroyed and built over. So you'd have to demolish whatever had been built in place and then almost restart from scratch. And even if you're in a lucky circumstance where perhaps the basic floor area was still there, but the mechanisms have been taken off and scrapped and sold, you'd still have to find someone to manufacture the pumps, the cranes, the rails, etc., 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 and install all of those first before you could reopen a yard. Not Shaped for Sportive Tricks asks, paintings of naval battles often show ships' boats splashing about in the middle of an engagement. For example, Turner's painting of Trafalgar. Did this actually happen, and if so, what were they doing and why? I would have thought that all hands would have been wanted on board. Ships' boats would sometimes be seen going around during a naval engagement, but it wasn't as common as some paintings would lead you to believe. So a lot of paintings at that time, especially these grand close-ups like you see here with Turner's Trafalgar, were in part realistic. The depiction of victory is actually a pretty good one. However, there's also a lot of allegory going on. So, for example, in the foreground, you can see there's a Union Jack draped over some wreckage. Well, as we know, there were no British ships sunk or otherwise lost at the Battle of Trafalgar. So, essentially, what they're doing is, rather than just having general seascape up front in the foreground of the picture, they're using illustrations of stuff that technically was at the battle, like ships, boats, and sailors and wreckage in the water, to express a certain degree of allegory, in this case representing the sacrifice of Trafalgar. And similarly, no ship listed to port and capsized right next to Victory, as you can see happening there on the right. So it's a mixture of allegory and realistic depiction. Now, with that said, would you see ship's boats going around? As I said, yes, occasionally. So the two primary reasons you might see ship's boats meandering around in the middle of an age of sail battle would be, one, if there had been some tragic accident, like a ship catching fire and blowing up, or being hit so badly in some other method that caused it to sink in the middle of a fight. At that point, ship's boats were very often deployed to rescue survivors. And we do have plenty of records of that happening at various points in major engagements. The other thing, of course, being that if a ship had surrendered, it was somewhat dangerous in the middle of a battle if you hadn't forced it to surrender by boarding action, to then take your ship alongside and directly board the vessel to take its surrender. And so ship's boats would be dispatched to go out and accept the surrender of a ship that had struck its colours. A tertiary use would also be occasionally for carrying messages to and from different ships, if all other forms of communication were not available, or the message was a particularly complex one, or something you didn't want to publicly advertise. Like, for example, if Trafalgar Nelson has died, and Collingwood needs to be told to take command, well, you're not exactly going to signal that via flag so that the Franco-Spanish fleet can see, and Victory and Royal Sovereign are a little bit beyond yelling range. So at that point, you'd send a ship's boat out. Now, of course, the vast majority, if not all ship's boats, generally in age of sail engagements, were actually towed behind the ship in question, partly so that they were less of a target, and B, obviously then if they were hit, they weren't causing massive splinters to go everywhere aboard the ship in question. And so usually if you did want to dispatch a ship's boat, it would have to be hauled in via the rope it was attached to, and then obviously people could be deployed to it, and off it would go. Cameron Rogers asks, continuing the somewhat ridiculous line of thinking of a Lexington-class battlecruiser in World War II, how would a Lexington-class have fared at the Battle of Denmark Strait in place of HMS Hood or Bismarck? So, if we put a Lexington in the place of Bismarck, it's potentially either going to do much, much better or much, much worse, depending on exactly what goes on. So, the situation it could do much, much better. Bear in mind, the Germans don't actually want to fight Hood and Prince of Wales. They're supposed to be going out on a commerce raiding mission and potentially getting shot up by British capital ships rather ruins that. And in fact, even with Hood's destruction, being shot up by Prince of Wales did ruin Bismarck's day. But Lexington is 3 knots faster than Bismarck. So, in theory, assuming that they notice the British coming in time, a Lexington in place of Bismarck could just go speed and vanish over the horizon at 33 knots. I mean, to be perfectly honest, probably have done that to break contact with Suffolk and Norfolk as well, instead, assuming, of course, that Prince Eugen can keep up with you. So that's good. Conversely, it could have also gone a lot worse, because Lexington has precisely no armour, essentially, when it comes to repelling 14-inch and 15-inch shells at 15 to 20,000 yards. And yes, she does have armour, but it's not really going to actually do anything other than helpfully activate the fuses on the shells. And, of course, if she's actually built, then, in theory, a 1920s design is going to have 1920s fire control equipment, which means she's not going to be as accurate as Bismarck was, which in turn means that, given that Prince of Wales was already scoring hits, both Hood and Prince of Wales are going to get into their final engagement range. They're going to turn full broadside. They're going to unleash all their guns, and it's going to end very badly for the Marque? Bissington? I don't know, whichever one. Now, if you flip that back round and you say, okay, well, what if there's a Lexington in place of Hood? Well, now you have a little bit of a problem, because if Hood, or what should we call this, Hoodington? Yeah, let's call it Hoodington, because Lexud doesn't sound very good. But so, yeah, Hoodington, again, should in theory be faster than the historical Hood, but is tied to Prince of Wales. So unless they want to break formation, that advantage isn't really going to be there. Now it has a similar problem of essentially not having any real substantial armour protection against incoming fire from Bismarck. The primary armour should still repel shells from Prince Eugen, just about. And given that Lexington and Hood are within about 15 feet of length of each other, she's going to have a similar weakness point to Hood. However, she might actually survive purely because in the area, if you look at plans for Hood, where the shell came in and destroyed her, on the Lexingtons, that area is not the end of the machinery space, so we're talking about just forward of the mainmast and directly adjacent to the mainmast. That area is still just boiler rooms and machinery. There's not a 4-inch anti-aircraft magazine or even a secondary magazine there, which means that the precise hit, assuming that it was still scored, that on a Lexington, or in this case at Hoodington, that actually killed Hood it would be bad. It would cause significant flooding and loss of power in various machinery spaces and force the ship to break off the action. But there would be enough metal in the way to prevent it from actually causing magazine detonation. Of course, the flip side of that is that due to the lack of any significant protection against Bismarck's incoming shells, unless it was massively refitted during the interwar period, the Hoodington would be far more vulnerable to just being hit generally, and potentially follow-up shots going straight into the magazines as compared to Hood. So you win some, you lose some. Lord Druken asks, did the US Navy ever attempt to employ the Coles turret design on any of their monitors during the Civil War, or did they stick to the Ericsson design because that's what they knew worked at the time? And side note, would you consider the amphibious assault ship the modern-day equivalent of an escort carrier, or, because they do more than just launch aircraft, is it another kind of warship entirely? As far as I'm aware, the vast majority of monitors that the US built in the American Civil War used the Ericsson-style turret design, with a handful also using the Eads turret design. I'm not immediately aware of any American Civil War-era monitors being built to the Coles turret design, and there's a few reasons for that. I mean, one of them being Ericsson oversaw in some way, shape or form the design and construction of most of the American monitors, so of course he's going to want to use his own turret design for the most part. But also, while the Coles turret was a superior design, and in some ways was mechanically a little bit simpler, the Ericsson turret was more easily able to be built. It does have a number of disadvantages versus the Coles turret, but one of its advantages is that despite being a little bit of a Rube Goldberg machine when it comes to actually rotating the blasted thing, the individual components are somewhat simpler to manufacture. They don't require quite the same degree of precision engineering. They require some, but not as much. And particularly with things like the turret track and so forth. Again, you can basically knock out an Ericsson turret using a slightly simpler industrial base somewhat faster than the more complex Coles turret, at least complex when it comes to what level of engineering you need. So obviously for somewhere like Britain, which was at peace and had the world's leading industrial base, they could make lots of Coles turrets, whereas if you're trying to knock out a ton of quick and easy monitors in a fractured and slightly technologically behind US industrial base, the Ericsson turret, to a certain degree, makes an amount of sense, although towards the end, when you're talking about big turrets with twin 15-inch Dahlgrens, some of the mechanical limitations of the Ericsson were definitely showing. As far as the amphibious assault ship element of the question, I don't think they're the modern equivalent of an escort carrier, although they are boxy vessels of around about 20 knots, give or take a little bit, with a flight deck on them, which you'd think would kind of make them like escort carriers. They do have an entirely different role and purpose. They carry aircraft largely in support of the amphibious landings that they also are supposed to support with troops and so forth and landing craft stored internally, and most of those aircraft are helicopters. Now, of course, anti-submarine warfare does, at least from the aerial perspective and from ships at sea, revolve largely around helicopters these days, but the helicopters that a vessel like this is the USS Iwo Jima are intended to use are mostly transport types, and the occasional attack type, not so much an anti-submarine helicopter. You could, in theory, perhaps use the design of an amphibious assault vessel to create a class of escort carriers, but when you think the escort carrier's primary role is anti-submarine warfare via, obviously, mass aerial surveillance, and defense of convoys and things with a limited number of fighters aboard, as I said, you could use these hulls for it, but they're not designed for it, and therefore I don't think they are actually that equivalent. If anything, at least in the Western navies has come close to that as far as a whole class would go. I'd say you're probably actually looking at something more like the Invincible class of the Royal Navy of the 1980s, 1990s, because, well, they are definitely not amphibious assault vessels, and ultimately they were essentially designed mostly to do anti-submarine warfare and limited convoys protection against bombers, running to and from mostly doing reforger convoys in the event the Cold War had gone hot. So actually, they're probably the closest thing that has been built to a modern-ish escort carrier, at least in any great numbers. You can point to any number of small one-off groups in various other European navies and perhaps make similar arguments for them, but the Invincibles, both in purpose and number, probably come the closest. Kern van Krooning asks, to what extent was the development of the cruiser as a ship for long-range and overseas missions that is armed and armoured more lightly than a battleship in the 19th century contingent on there being very few peer opponents outside of Europe? It's not really that contingent on not having peer opponents outside of Europe, because the cruiser as a role and as a concept is a vessel that has kind of gone extinct and then regenerated itself and gone extinct and regenerated itself a number of times. Bearing in mind that prior to the latter part of the 19th century, cruiser was a mission, not a ship type. So in the Napoleonic Wars, for example, you could have a frigate that was sent on a cruiser mission. You could have a sloop or a brig that was sent on a cruiser mission. You could have a third-rate ship of the line sent on the cruiser mission, and all of those would be cruisers while they were doing that mission. But as soon as they stopped doing that mission, they reverted to being something else. And indeed, the very fact we got the cruiser as a role type and as a vessel classification simply came about because the majority of cruisers, in terms of mission type, in the last periods of the Age of Sail were your big frigates and your smaller ships of the line. But with the advent of iron hulls and iron armour and bigger guns, the idea of having multiple grades of ships of the line, like the first rate, second rate, third rate, fourth rate, kind of went out the window. You could have small armoured warships if you couldn't afford anything larger, but if you were any kind of serious navy, you had the biggest, most heavily armed, most heavily protected warships you could get, i.e. the sail equivalent of a first rate. So generally speaking, the role that had previously been filled by third rates and fourth rates, which were your most common cruisers, and large frigates for that matter, had disappeared. And what had happened was sloops, corvettes, brigs, schooners, and all number of other smaller ship classes, i.e. the stuff that had usually been unrated in the Age of Sail, had grown in size, and they were now doing the cruising role. And this was all very, very confusing for everybody because, while a lot of these ideas were based around the rigging plans of older ships, and now rigging plans were becoming less and less relevant. So what exactly made this corvette different from this schooner, from this brig, from whatever, and, well, for that matter, even frigates. And so the whole thing just got amalgamated by the Royal Navy, where they just went, no, this is dumb. We're just going to say all of these ships, i.e. the non-capital units, are all now cruisers. Now, of course, that meant you had a whole range of size and capability, so they very quickly had to devise first, second, and third class cruisers. But that was just sort of relative power to each other. The ships themselves weren't some kind of new invention. It was just a reclassification of what was already there for the sake of simplicity. Now, of course, from that, you then get the evolution of the protected cruiser and the armoured cruiser as separate things. And fundamentally, whether or not you have peer opponents outside of Europe isn't really going to change that all that much, I don't think. I mean, it does drive some consideration of what kind of cruiser you have. So, for example, although it's not technically known as a cruiser at the time, when HMS Shah engages Huascar, she is eventually classified as a cruiser. So you could say she is a cruiser deployed by the Royal Navy to South America. The fact that a small armoured ship can still basically make her stand off and render her relatively ineffective helps drive the development of the armoured cruiser, but it's still a kind of cruiser. And even if you did have large navies, or larger navies at least, that had a number of battleships and so forth, Cruisers are still going to be used because battleships, due to the requirements of their design, are going to be somewhat shorter range, so not suitable for overseas deployment a lot of the time unless you happen to have an overseas base. They're also rather big and expensive and rather serious statements of power, so you can only use them on long-distance missions like you would use a cruiser for in very limited circumstances. And ultimately, during a good chunk of the 19th century, they're also pretty useless for commerce raiding, because if a battleship shows up, an ironclad or a pre-dreadnought, unless you're a tramp steamer or something really slow, your best defense is just to run away. And there's not a huge amount that the battleship can do, even if it's marginally faster than you. Let's say you make 12 knots and it makes 15. The rate of closure is going to be such that you can probably keep the chase going for days on end, during which time the battleship's getting strung out miles away from where it actually wants to be. So again, you can probably escape. Whereas cruisers have a distinct advantage in speed over almost any merchant ship that isn't an ocean liner, and therefore they can actually run down and intercept merchant vessels and likewise provide broad spectrum coverage against similar type raiders. Captain Oblivious asks, as you likely know, the excellent Channel World War II Bombers has been running a series on aircraft versus naval assets. In the series on ship sinking strategies, he stated the goal of air-launched torpedoes was to aim for the ship's vulnerable magazine or fuel storage locations. I was always under the impression it was hard enough to hit a ship with an air-launched torpedo, let alone target a specific location. How realistic is it for a pilot to target a specific area while getting shot at and planning his escape after torpedo launch, all while reciting his Hail Marys? Well, I think the statement, aim for the ship's vulnerable magazine or fuel storage locations, could be interpreted in a way that would be a little bit more correct. So I would say, yes, objectively, if you're going to say, oh, we're aiming our torpedoes at the magazines or the fuel stores or the machinery space as well. I mean, they're pretty vulnerable. That would be wrong because, like I said, it's pretty darn difficult to hit a ship with an airdrop torpedo or any launch torpedo, especially in the World War II environment, which is why you fire big spreads, or if you're launching from aircraft, you drop lots and lots of torpedoes. The idea is, well, we're aiming roughly in that direction and hopefully something will hit. Most of the time, they were aiming for either center of mass or maybe slightly forward of that, something like the bridge, simply because it made a useful aim point. And of course, if you aim for roughly the center of mass or slightly ahead of it, then you've got an awful lot of deviation. So, if you're firing at a ship that is 600, 700, 800 feet long and you aim, let's say, roughly dead center, around about 400 foot along, your aim can be off by 400 feet to the left or the right, and you will still just about hit something. Whereas if you aim for, say, the magazine under the forward gun turret, well, okay, at that point, yeah, sure, if your aim is off, let's say the ship is progressing from port to starboard, so let's say that you underestimate the ship's speed, then sure, that gives you maybe a 500-600 foot margin of error. But if you have overestimated the ship's speed, you've maybe only got 100-200 foot margin of error. And given the practicalities of aiming at that stage, that's not really a bet you'd necessarily want to take. So yeah, you're more aiming just to hit the ship, because any hit is good. Some hits are better than others, obviously, but any hit is useful. But reinterpretation, aiming for the ship's vulnerable magazine, fuel storage, and I'll append into that machinery spaces, would be, you could interpret that as, well, if you're firing a shell, the magazines, the fuel storage, and the machinery are generally very deep in the ship, below the waterline and behind armour, so they're very difficult to hit with shells. Whereas a torpedo, because it goes underwater, has a much more direct path, and in fact, being targeted at earlier ships, a very direct path, because it goes completely underneath the armour protection and near enough directly accesses those very vulnerable areas, which obviously is good for the person firing the torpedo and forces the introduction of torpedo defences. So if you interpret aim for as in can actually directly hit and requires specific defensive measures to try and prevent, then at that point you could agree with the statement. But obviously, bearing in mind as well, the ship gets a vote. It's going to be manoeuvring, changing its course and speed all the time. You're never going to be aiming with a torpedo at a specific point on a ship. I mean, shells arrive a heck of a lot faster, and they're not aiming usually, unless it's absolute point blank, for specific parts of the ship. They're just aiming to try and hit the blasted thing in the first place. I mean, it's obviously very telling that, for example, if you read the accounts of the Swordfish pilots who attacked Bismarck, they're basically aiming slightly forward of centre of mass. They're basically aiming at the bridge superstructure for the most part. And yet the critical hit where everyone goes, huzzah, is at the stern, which means that either that pilot significantly underestimated how fast Bismarck was going, or else Bismarck did some other kind of maneuver that meant that she got hit in the stern rather than where that torpedo was actually aiming for. Still, obviously, it was a good hit, but not necessarily. The Swordfish pilot didn't go in saying, "Aha, I am deliberately going to target your stern and screws in an effort to cripple you." And similarly, look at the run-up to the Battle of Cape Matapan. You have, again, Swordfish for the most part, going after the Italians. They score a very similar hit to the one they do on Bismarck on Vittorio Veneto. Again, they're not aiming to cripple her stern, but they manage to hit her stern anyway. But at the same time, they actually do get a direct hit of the type that they're actually looking for when they hit Pola and manage to cripple her completely. But how many times do you get that kind of, amidships crippling shot compared to the number of torpedo hits that are actually scored on various warships? Brian Nicholas asks, "Hello, Drac. You often mention that there were differences between each nation's heavy guns, even though they were of the same caliber. Being an engineer, could you explain some of the differences between a British 14-inch gun, an American one, a German one, Japanese, etc., etc.? Was it more than just the breech block? Was it the method of construction, etc., etc.?" So this is obviously not a fully comprehensive list of differences, because that could go on forever and a day. But if we look at a number of guns, so we'll look at the US, British, Japanese, technically for the Congos, but related to the British because and initially actually are British 14-inch guns, and we'll look at the German 13.8-inch as was supposed to be on the Mackensons, mostly just so we have a bit more flavour going in. So yeah, you've got obviously sliding breeches on the German 13.8s. You've got more normally the interrupted screw breech block on everybody else's. But there's quite a number of other differences as well. So most of the guns in question are 45 calibers in length, so 14 inches multiplied by 45. But of course, while the US has the 45 caliber 14-inch on the New York, Nevada, and Pennsylvania classes, on the New Mexicos, the Tennessees, and in some other designs that they implement but don't fully construct, they have 14-inch 50 caliber guns, so you can have different lengths of said gun. Construction methods also vary. So, for example, the British and obviously therefore also Japanese, both Japanese bought and then Japanese built guns, are wire wound guns. And we could have a completely separate discussion about the benefits and the disadvantages of wire wound versus hoop construction. But suffice to say, those guns are wire wound. The American guns, for example, are made in the hoop structure. And one of the ways that you can see the difference, it's not quite worth looking at the weight of the German gun, because of course it is a 13.8-inch. It is a physically smaller gun anyway, very slightly, but it does make a difference when it comes to weight. The British guns and the Japanese guns, because there are multiple 14-inch guns actually being built by different manufacturers in the UK, come in at around 86 tons per gun, whereas the 45 caliber 14-inch, so directly equivalent in size for the Americans, using the hoop method of construction, is only about 64, 65 tons in weight. And even the 50 caliber, which adds another 5 calibers of length onto compared to all the other guns, is still only about 81.5 tons. So they're somewhat lighter than the British and Japanese guns. Then you've got the twist of the rifling. So the British and Japanese guns use a 1 in 30, as do, in fact, the German 13.8s, whereas the American guns use a variety of rifling ratios, none of which are 1 in 30. Some of them, depending on which marque of gun you're looking at, are 1 in 25, and some of the early marques at least, use varying rifling. So it's 1 in 50 near the beginning, near the breech, and 1 in 32 by the time it gets to the muzzle. And one final thing by which you can see just how many differences there are, and we could go on and on and on, is the chamber volume. So the volume that the charge has. And actually, the original American 14-inch 45 has the smallest chamber volume at just over 15,000 cubic inches. The German 13.8, despite being a slightly smaller gun, actually has a slightly larger chamber volume at just over 15,800 cubic inches, although the US gun is then, the 14-inch 45, then is later, has a larger chamber introduced with just over 18,000 cubic inches involved. Then, sort of at roughly the same level, at almost exactly 18,000 cubic inches, of the Japanese guns, because as I said, you have multiple types of 14-inch gun being built in the UK. Then you have the 14-inch 50 American gun, which has 19,500 approximately cubic inches in its chamber, and the single largest chambers are a completely separate British 14-inch gun, which is the one that ends up on Almirante Littorio and would have ended up on Almirante Cochrane, and that is a 14-inch 45 caliber gun, but it has a 23,500 cubic inch volume. So that gives you some idea of a few of the differences between the various 14-inch or 14-inch adjacent guns. John McCarthy asks, you've often explained why Bismarck was an inefficient design, but what about efficient designs? Could you pick, say, 2 or 3 ships with efficient designs and explain what makes them such? To narrow things down a bit, please consider battleships from HMS Dreadnought onwards. So, there are quite a number of ways of measuring efficiency in design. And, well, I'll start off by getting my traditional jab in. Bismarck doesn't tick any of those boxes. But if you're looking for ships to say that these are efficient designs, we'll look at a few, but they are efficient in different ways. One of the ones that is really a contrast in efficiency, where you can make an argument they're very inefficient ships, but you can also make, I think, a more correct argument that they are very efficient ships, is the South Dakota class. And which you can see here, this is in fact USS South Dakota. Now, the reason I say that these are both inefficient and very efficient ships is because if you look by some metrics, like, let's say, amount of power required to reach a given amount of speed, they're actually very inefficient. They need around 130,000 shaft horsepower to reach just over 27 knots at a notional displacement of about 35,000 tons, whereas their immediate predecessors, the North Carolinas, notionally displace about the same, but need somewhat less shaft horsepower to move slightly faster and have a slightly better range. But the reason for that fuel inefficiency is because of a whole bunch of other efficiencies that are put into the ship. So both the North Carolina class and the South Dakota class obviously share a main armament of 9 16-inch guns in 3 triple turrets, and apart from South Dakota herself, which sacrifices one set of 5-inch 38 mountings in exchange for flag officer accommodations, they have the same secondary battery and so forth. But on the North Carolinas, they have a protection scheme that is laid out to protect them against what should have been their main armament, 14-inch guns, and then they have their armament changed to 16-inch guns at the last minute. So they actually break the general battleship rule of thumb of where most battleships should have armor protection at reasonable ranges against their own guns. Whereas with the South Dakotas, they set out to go, okay, we want a treaty-compliant 35,000-ton battleship with a 16-inch gun armament, but which also has armor protection against her own armament, which by most metrics shouldn't be possible. The Lion class is probably the only one other ship that was designed towards this approximate goal, but the South Dakotas are the only ones that are actually built showing that you can actually pull it off. And some of the sacrifice they have to make that work is to have a shorter hull, so its length to breadth ratio is less, hence why you need more power to go at a similar speed. But to get a decent speed, a slightly oversized engineering plant, 16-inch main armament and protection against the same, into actually a slightly smaller overall hull that still displaces just about treaty limits, that's a mark of massive engineering efficiency. The Revenge class would actually be another example because, much as I love the Queen Elizabeths, and they could have been on this list, the reason they're not is because they don't end up using small tube boilers when they were in fact available, and as most of you watching the channel for a while already know. And compared to the Queen Elizabeths, the Revenge class on about 3,000 tons or so less, managed to fit exactly the same main armament, same thickness of armour, but better distributed, and only dropped about 2 to 3 knots for the privilege of doing so. So if you had expanded out the Revenge class with its, changes in armour, scheme and efficiency, and given its full small tube boilers back up to the scale of a Queen Elizabeth class, you would have got a considerably faster vessel. So while the Queen Elizabeths were the superior vessel for going into the Second World War, thanks mostly to their speed, and obviously the slightly bigger size giving them room for upgrades, in terms of an exercise in efficiency, squeezing as much capability as possible into as small as hull possible, the Revenge class is actually a slightly better technical exercise. And while I would be very tempted to include Richelieu, and she is actually a good example of an efficient design, I think that the forced circulation boilers are a little bit of a cheat there. I mean, it makes her a very efficient design for the tonnage, but compared to everybody else, which is what we're doing, if the others don't have access to that, if other people had that technology, what could they have done with it? That's a whole other argument. The Nelson class is also potentially an argument you could look at some point. However, while you did say please consider battleships, I am actually going to throw one other one in, one of my personal favourites and relatively underappreciated, the light cruiser La Argentina, designed actually as a training and school vessel as well as a light cruiser. I have covered her in the past on the channel, but compare her to other ships in the roughly 6,000 to 7,000 ton displacement category, things like the Königsbergs and the Leanders. So, okay, they all have a similar level of armament. La Argentina has 9 6-inch guns, Königsberg's 9 5.9s, the Leander 8 6-inch guns. They all have torpedo launchers, but La Argentina manages to have, along with the Königsbergs, the efficient triple turret layout, laid out somewhat better for a warship with 2 triples up front, 1 aft instead of the other way around. She has superior protection to either of the others. She has thicker belt and thicker deck than the Königsbergs, and the same thickness of belt armour as the Leanders over a larger space. The Leanders only having box armour, as well as still having thicker deck armour, and has thicker turret armour than all of them, so she's a much better protected vessel than those other two. And as I say, she has torpedo launchers. The only thing she's really lacking in compared to the others is speed. She's still got a respectable 30-knot speed. Okay, the Königsbergs can do 32, the Leanders can do 32.5, but as I mentioned, La Argentina was designed as a school ship, so she has extra accommodation and class spaces for cadets, at which point, I think as I pointed out in my video on her, if you had taken essentially the La Argentina hull and just gone, okay, we'll get rid of those spaces and expanded the machinery spaces slightly, you would have ended up with a ship easily capable of 32 or 33 knots with a similar 6-inch armament to other ships in that size category, as I said, and decent protection and decent speed. It's a really, really good example of an efficient hull design. His Hynerian Majesty Rigel the 16th, Dominator 600 billion subjects, progenitor of many and nobody's puppet, asks, if you were granted a letter of marque today, under what conditions would you accept it? Well, unfortunately, the days when chartering or buying a small ship and fitting it up with military-grade weaponry to go and attack the king's enemies on the high seas was possible for even a man of relatively mediocre income are long past. So, a letter of marque today, licensed to attack various people who have displeased the UK, I think would either have to come with a grant for a ship, maybe one of the Type 23s they're in the process of getting rid of, or else a whole ton of money to buy and outfit a ship. I think it's probably more likely they'd give me some money to refit a Type 23 or something like that. But hey, once you give me enough money to man and equip an old Type 23 frigate, I will quite happily go out and engage most things on the high seas. Given the value of oil at the moment, if I'm a privateer, technically I can do almost whatever I want. There's a bunch of shadow fleet tankers full of gas and oil. Just seize that lot, bring them in for and sell off all the oil as cargo. That's how they did it. That's how they would have done it in the old days if oil was a cargo back then, instead of movable, valuable goods. Become the greatest floating oil baron on the high seas, enforced by firepower. Ark Dennis asks, with apologies for a three-parter, in 1942, General Auchinleck, Commander-in-Chief Middle East, stepped in and took over direct control of 8th Army as it retreated to El Alamein. Could this have happened in a naval context? For instance, could Nimitz have flown out from Pearl Harbor and taken direct control of a 3rd Fleet, or Lord Gambier go and take command before Trafalgar? Did commanding admirals have that sort of discretionary power, and did anyone ever use it? Related, what staff admiral, who never actually commanded a fleet in battle, would have been best at it? And for fun, if Jackie Fisher had refused Churchill's recall to the Admiralty in 1914 and instead demanded a fleet command, where would you have put him to best use? I wonder if he wouldn't have been a right nuisance as commander of the Harwich Force, or maybe give him the battle cruisers instead of giving them to Beatty. Okay, so firstly, could someone further up the chain like Nimitz or Gambier step in and take command of a fleet? Theoretically, yes, but it would depend on the circumstances. For example, obviously, if the lower-ranking admiral had died or been otherwise incapacitated, or there are serious concerns about their command, then obviously they could show up and say, okay, you're relieved. Or if the ranking officer was bringing in significant reinforcements. So, for example, if someone like Gambier showed up with another dozen ships of the line, then they could reasonably plausibly say, okay, and also I'm in charge of the overall fleet. However, just showing up with a ship and going, hey, now I'm in charge, especially in the Age of Sail, would go down very badly. But it also depends on who has appointed that person to command. So let's take the example of Trafalgar when Nelson. So obviously not commenting specifically on Nelson Trafalgar, but using an example like that. If Nelson has been appointed by Gambier, i.e. so the Royal Navy, the Admiralty, has said to Gambier, hey, look, you've got all these ships under your command, and we want you to allocate a blockading squadron to Cadiz. If Gambier goes, okay, well, I am going to choose this admiral from my collection, and he's going to go and be the commander of the blockade, then obviously it is within his power to take that back if he wants to. Obviously, for social and proprietary reasons, he'd have to justify it, but he could show up and say quite easily, actually, I've changed my mind. Conversely, if you've got the whole situation, but then instead the Admiralty has said, we appoint this admiral, Nelson in this case, to go after Villeneuve, even though Gambier would be a superior officer by rank, if Nelson's orders to command this fleet come directly from the Admiralty, they obviously trump Gambier in most circumstances outside of the ones I outlined at the beginning, and therefore he would have to at least inform and much more likely get direct permission from the Admiralty if he wanted to go and take over. And similarly, in cases like in the modern era, like you say, with Nimitz and so forth, if there is a vacancy, then caused by death or incapacitation, then yes, of course, you can fly in and take over. Otherwise, unless there's some kind of extreme criminal negligence that's resulting in that officer being almost immediately relieved of command, just showing up and saying, actually, I'm going to take in charge, thanks, but off you go. That is effectively almost court-martial and dismissal for lack of faith in their ability to continue to command without actually doing the court-martial thing, which, then the officer in question probably will demand a court-martial to clear their name from the massive slight it would be. For the final bit, where would you put Fisher if he wanted a fleet command? I personally, at the beginning of the war, would put him in the Mediterranean to replace Milne, because if there's one thing, given his experience of commanding in the Mediterranean and his natural aggression, if there's one thing Fisher would have done, he would have, A, stuck to Goeben like glue, B, possibly engineered a situation where he would just go, you know what, we're technically not at war with Germany, but stuff it, and open fire on her at point-blank range as they passed on opposite courses. And even if he didn't do any of that, you can absolutely guarantee that he would have been chasing down Goeben hard with his battle cruisers trying to force contact. So that would be probably the best place to put him. And as far as which staff admirals who had never actually commanded a fleet in battle would have been best at it, I mean, I'm going to cheat slightly and say either Backhouse or the other Fisher, William Fisher, because both of them got to admiralty level during the interwar period. Both of them were incredibly competent officers in exercises. Both of them also obviously did their periods behind a desk, especially towards the end of his career. Backhouse, both of them died before World War II broke out, but almost certainly would have made excellent admirals at sea, especially considering that between them, especially Fisher, but Backhouse to a certain extent as well, actually trained Cunningham, and well, yeah, look at what Cunningham accomplished. Sage of Irrelevance asks, something I occasionally hear in sci-fi and other fiction with naval influences is a medic or ship's doctor telling a higher ranking officer something along the lines of, when it comes to the health of the crew, I outrank everyone. How does this work in reality? Could a ship's doctor actually override or give orders to a captain in some circumstances? Or was it more like a captain ignores a ship's doctor at his own peril? Okay, so timeline-wise, for the majority of the period the channel covers, the ship's doctor has no real power outside of an advisory role. So if he gets on particularly well with the captain and has a good track record and is respected by the crew, then his recommendations are far more likely to be listened to. If he has a bad track record or the captain just doesn't like him for whatever reason, then almost no matter what he says, he's probably just going to be ignored. However, the increasing professionalism of the medical profession, as well as the growing formalization of navies, means that when you combine these two things together, you end up with medical officers getting more and more formalized powers, obviously depending on exactly the navy, but roughly speaking through the mid to late 19th centuries. And then by the 20th century, things have become fully formalized to the degree that, well, not the way that people sometimes think, but to the degree that it roughly is even today. And so a medical officer's authority is essentially divided, if you like, into three broad arcs. The area where a medical officer by, say, World War I and World War II has absolute authority is with direct relation to the health of the crew. Like, is this man healthy enough to resume active duty or not, for example? Or should this man be taken off active duty? In those circumstances, regardless of what the other officers say, if the medical officer says, no, this man is in my care, then by the law of, or the operating procedure for that navy, the other officers cannot overrule him. You then have a slight grey area where the medical officer is able to make recommendations, and these recommendations should be very strongly encouraged to be followed, but ultimately the decision of whether or not to follow them rests with the captain. But like you said, towards the end, it will be, ignore at your own peril. So if the doctor says, okay, well, like you can see here, this man is very seriously ill and he needs to be medically evacuated ashore for better treatment, that would be his absolute statement of what should be the case. And the captain, obviously, if he ignores that, the potential consequences are this man could die. However, the captain still has the operational freedom to make the decision of, is this ship going to change course or not? And the captain, of course, has to weigh up things like, will this take us away from our mission? And if so, how vitally important is that mission? What risks would I be putting the rest of the crew in if I did what the medical officer said? And so on and so forth. So, for example, if you think there's submarines operating off of your coastline, off the coastline of the area where the nearest available medical facilities are, do you take your ship into potentially sub-infested waters and risk everyone for the sake of one person? Or if you know that a certain area is likely to have a lot of enemy aircraft overhead and therefore you could be bombed, circumstances like this, or if you're due to rendezvous with a ship or provide support in some other way for other vessels. So that's kind of the grey area. And then of course you've got areas such which are not immediately concerned with the health and safety of the crew, but technically might, but these are areas where the doctors do not have authority. So, for example, obviously, if a ship is going into battle, well, going into battle does pose a health and safety risk to the crew, but the doctor has no place in advising whether or not the ship should do so. And unless there was something like very widespread sickness throughout the crew, in which case the doctor may give advice as to how capable the crew are overall of fulfilling the captain's orders. Now, of course, the ship's doctor will generally have other things he has direct authority over, like health and sanitation aboard the ship and so forth, but those don't tend to interface quite so much with the command and control choices of the ship as a whole in the way that the circumstances we just outlined did. Library of Context asks, during the classical age of sail, how much faster were mail ships or messenger ships as compared to dedicated warships like frigates or ships of the line, and how effective were these vessels in coordinating operations among various ports or stations? It's a little bit of a catch-22, actually, because in terms of absolute speeds, a lot of mail or messenger ships, which are often very often small schooners like HMS Pickle depicted here, famous for Trafalgar, weren't actually as fast as some of the big ships. So, a fast frigate like Endymion or Constitution or whatever might make 13 or 14 knots, possibly even more, in the right set of seas and winds. And particularly fast ships of the line, like Victory, might make 11 or 12 knots, again, maybe a fraction more, again, depending on the right combination of seas and winds. But the critical thing is that those combinations were different. So, for example, in medium, shall we say, mid-scale seas and winds, the average fast frigate will easily outrun the average fast ship of the line. However, as those winds increase and the seas become more violent, the ship of the line can hold its speed, and the frigate can't so much, and then suddenly the ship of the line becomes faster, and the ostensibly up until now faster frigate can find itself being run down, which is a very sobering experience for the frigate. Now, when it comes to the schooners and so forth, they very often couldn't actually manage 13, 14 knots. They would top out at maybe 10 or 11. So actually, on paper, the slowest of the three sizes of ship. However, they could maintain this speed, let's say, for the sake of argument, 10 knots, in very light airs, medium airs. They would obviously start to lose speed in rougher seas even faster than frigates would. But in the more typical sea conditions, where both frigates and ships of the line would be significantly more restricted in speed because they have a lot more mass to them to move around, a small light schooner or something like that with a lot of sail area in a small hull will be quite happily cruising along at 8 to 10 knots consistently. And so consistently over time for long distances, like moving mail, money, and messages around, then that is why they are considered to be fast ships. They're fast sailing, as in, while, yes, in, let's say, medium seas, the frigate will beat everyone in the race. In heavy seas, the ship of the line will beat everyone in the race. But if you say, okay, everyone, we're leaving from, say, Portsmouth and we're heading to Bermuda, or we're going from New York to Cape Town, assuming there aren't really major weather systems, like hurricanes and stuff in the way, in typical conditions, despite having the slowest of the top speeds, the schooner will be the one that arrives first because it could do 8 to 10 knots pretty much the entire way, whereas the frigates and the ships of the line will occasionally go faster but very often be travelling slower. Silderin Machine Works asks, for much of its history, England and then the UK had many crimes punishable by death, but reforms over the years reduced that number to 3, murder, treason and arson in the Royal Dockyards. I understand why a maritime nation would want to punish that last offence so severely, but do you know of anybody who was actually prosecuted or executed for doing that? And do you know of any other countries that had similar laws? I don't know about other nations having similar laws on the book, but I would imagine that they probably would, given the rather significant nature of setting fire to a dockyard, especially a military dockyard, and the multiple layers of crime that you would be committing, which essentially could add that up to sort of treason plus, which was essentially the argument behind the 1772 Act, which put this into play in the first place. But as far as that particular act goes, as far as I'm aware, and according to a report that was made to Parliament back in the latter half of the 20th century when they were considering abolishing the last few crimes that carried the death penalty in the UK, or abolishing the death penalty for those crimes, I should say. They reported that apparently there had only ever been one prosecution, which was this chap, John the Painter, a few years after the law was actually published back in the 1770s. He was hanged for setting fire to some rope stores and other such things. But ever since then, well, fortunately, there haven't been that many, if any, cases of sabotage in the Royal Docks. There have been one or two fires and such that have been suspected, but as far as I'm aware, they haven't managed. Those cases didn't result in any successful prosecutions of people. So it seems by mixture of, well, having naval bases staffed by people in the Royal Navy, as well as the rather obvious threat of punishment hanging over it, virtually no one was dumb enough to risk their luck in the couple of 100 years that the Act was in force. Chief Eyeroll asks, can you briefly discuss considerations for dual or progressive twist rates for naval gun barrels? What were the trade-offs for producing these types of barrels, and what applications were they used for in naval guns? So, progressive rifle twist rates were used in some guns, battleship guns for instance, but not in the majority of cases. Now, if you've ever looked down the barrel of a gun, you'll be familiar with what the rifling is. It looks like a series of parallel grooves or tracks that twist gradually round and round. And the twist rate is, the distance that you need to go down the barrel to complete one full rotation. So typically for battleship guns, you're looking at a twist rate of roughly 1 in 20 to 1 in 30. And somewhere in between is where most battleship gun barrels will sit. But most of the time, those twist rates, as I said, are consistent. So if it's 1 in, let's say, 25 at the breech end, it'll be 1 in 25 at the muzzle end. However, as mentioned in the question, there are some that have what's termed a progressive twist rate. So they'll have a longer ratio. For example, as we were talking about earlier in this Patron Drydock about 14-inch guns, perhaps a 1 in 50 ratio that might then reduce to 1 in 30 by the muzzle. So what that means is that at the breech end, where you've got a 1 in 50, then the rate of rotation is slower, and that gradually gets tighter and tighter as you get closer and closer to the muzzle, resulting obviously in more and more spin. Now, the reason that you might want to do this is that, of course, when the shell is initially fired, the shell has 0 rotational velocity. And it's not actually being given rotational velocity, it's being given forward velocity by the expansion of gases behind it. Then, obviously, the driving band bites into the rifling, and some of that forward velocity is turned by the resistance of the rifling driving band and the rifling on the driving band into rotational velocity. Now, of course, it's, let's say, starting from nothing and then having to accelerate. So going from nothing to, say, a 1 in 25 ratio or even a 1 in 20 ratio, which would be quite a tight one, can cause some issues. It can cause, obviously, stress in the shell. It's a rather violent acceleration in two directions because you've got rotational acceleration as well as acceleration down the barrel. And that can cause things like stripping of the driving bands or uneven, the shell moving up unevenly. It can cause issues. Not a lot of the time, but there is a possibility. And of course, the initial resistance as the driving band is being either bitten into, or if it's been bitten into by being loaded, starting to rotate, that's going to lead to a certain degree of friction. Whereas if you have a much gentler start, then obviously the resistance is less, therefore the acceleration forward is more, thus making more efficient use of the propulsion imparted by the charge. And as the shell gets faster, you increase the rate of twist, at which point you get the same rotational speed, hopefully coming out the end of the barrel, but with a smoother and more efficient acceleration path for the shell. So that all sounds good. Well, why don't they do it all the time? Well, the simple fact is, as per the video I did on the manufacture of naval guns, it is fiendishly difficult with the technology of the time, and to be honest, even today, to perfectly cut and rifle a battleship gun, or a cruiser gun for that matter, or anything like that. And that's if you're doing it at a consistent twist rate. if you want to factor in the additional complication of not just having two different twist rates, but the transition between them, that has just increased the difficulty of your task by several factors, and therefore, obviously, the possibility of something going wrong and you having to scrap the whole thing and start over again becomes even more. And you also have to do a few more calculations to make sure that you're getting exactly what you need, because obviously you don't want the change in the rotation per length being provided to be too sharp. You don't want it to be too little. And of course, you are going to have to perhaps also think about your driving bands, because if you look at the driving bands of a shell that's been fired but perhaps hasn't detonated, obviously those cuts in the driving band reflect the cuts of the rifling. If that is consistent, then it's you cut once and then off you go spinning. If it's different, you're starting with 1 in 50 and go to 1 in 30, then those raised and cut areas of the driving band are going to change and be deformed or recut as it accelerates down the barrel, and you've got to make sure that occurs in such a way that you don't get slippage or gaps forming, which might allow bursts of hot propellant gas through ahead of the shell more than you get already, and thus getting uneven flight. So theoretically good, technically fiendishly difficult to pull off, and therefore most of the time people didn't do it because the disadvantages just didn't outweigh the advantages. And particularly in cases like some of the US 14-inch guns, they might have started off with the idea and then dropped it for the sake of simplicity. Monsquire eventually wants to buy a C-177RG, asks, Admiral Karl Doenitz ordered his submarine arm to execute unrestricted submarine warfare, understanding an island nation such as the UK is very vulnerable to food and material shortages. Upon entry of the United States into the war, Admiral Thomas Hart ordered his small submarine force to do the same, and upon assuming command of the Pacific Fleet, one of the first orders Admiral Nimitz gave was to do the same, as they understood that Japan, also an island nation, had the same vulnerability as the UK. With this information, why did the courts at Nuremberg want to charge Doenitz with this as a war crime, eventually deciding not to after receiving communication and testimony from Fleet Admiral Nimitz? Because under the rules of warfare, Geneva Protocols and so forth, as everybody understood them going into World War II, unrestricted submarine warfare was a war crime. Specifically, everyone who had signed up to the London Naval Treaty had agreed to Part 4, Article 22, which I will read, and it says, the following are accepted as established rules of international law. 1. In their action with regard to merchant ships, submarines must conform to the rules of international law to which surface vessels are subject. 2. In particular, except in the case of persistent refusal to stop on being duly summoned or of active resistance to visit or search, a warship, whether surface vessel or submarine, may not sink or render incapable of navigation a merchant vessel without having first placed passengers, crew, and ship's papers in a place of safety. For this purpose, the ship's boats are not regarded as a place of safety unless the safety of passengers and crew is assured, in the existing sea and weather conditions, by the proximity of land or the presence of another vessel which is in a position to take them on board. The high contracting parties invite all other powers to express their assent to the above rules. And then in Article 23, which is Part 5, while acknowledging that the present London Naval Treaty would expire at the end of 1936, there was an exception, which was Part 4, i.e. Article 22 on submarine warfare, should remain in force without a limit of time. And so, obviously, the first London Naval Treaty, Britain, United States, France, Italy, Japan had signed up to this. Germany had agreed during the 1930s as part of the Anglo-German Naval Treaty to adhere to that protocol. So everybody who got involved in World War II, technically speaking, had agreed that submarines would follow cruiser rules warfare, i.e. you had to surface, stop the ship, let everybody get off, tell them where they needed to go for safety, possibly radio their position in if you're in the middle of the Atlantic, and then you could sink the ship. Of course, unrestricted submarine warfare, where you just shoot torpedoes at merchant ships without any warning, is against that. Therefore, if you did that, you were committing a war crime. And since, well, the German U-boats pretty much took that approach for almost the entirety of World War II, understandably, they went, another thing to charge Doenitz with. However, they then ran into the problem, as you mentioned, that, well, everybody else had done it as well. So they were then left with the slight problem of, if you prosecute Doenitz for what is actually technically, well, and and in reality, a clear violation of international law, and therefore the commission of war crimes on a wide scale, you would also have to charge a lot of Allied admirals and submarine crews with exactly the same thing, because that is exactly what they'd done to the enemy. At which point, being the victors and able to thus dictate who was and wasn't going to get prosecuted at Nuremberg, the Allies turned around and went, "Okay, we're just going to give that one a wash," when they realised that there would be no legal justification for excluding their officers from doing exactly what Doenitz had told his U-boats to do. And this is why very often international law is essentially a joke dictated by the most powerful nation on the planet at the time, because, well, essentially they get to make it or break it as much as they like, whenever they like, because ultimately who's going to back up said international law except by force of arms? And oh, look, if you're the strongest nation on the planet, you're the one who gets to have the greatest force of arms. So, yeah, don't kid yourself. World War I, World War II, or to be honest, even now, although obviously I stay away from modern history, international law doesn't mean anything and isn't worth the paper it's written on, unless and until the people with the most military power decide to back it up. And if they decide it doesn't apply, well, guess what? It doesn't apply, because without their help, good luck prosecuting anyone. 22NF2 asks, in instances where capital ships were sunk in battle, how often does rudder damage play a major role in their eventual demise? I understand this was so for ships like Bismarck, or possibly Yamato, but is this unique to those instances? Well, it certainly doesn't help, but it's not necessarily going to result in the destruction of a vessel. So, for example, Vittorio Veneto took major damage to her rudders from an aerial torpedo strike during the broader action of the Battle of Cape Matapan, but she wasn't destroyed at the time because she managed to make repairs and escape before British battleships could catch up with her. Now, there were ships where they did have rudder damage or steering gear damage, but that would be incidental to their overall demise. So, for example, ironically enough, HMS Hood, the first thing that was reported on the bridge that told them that anything particularly was wrong was when the helm told them that the steering was gone. Now, of course, that was thanks more to the utter obliteration of the steerage linkages than actual damage to the rudder itself. But still, it was indicative of a slightly bigger issue that was going on behind them. Likewise, Kirishima almost certainly took damage to her steering mechanisms. Not really a massive issue in whether or not she was going to sink, though, because, well, again, much bigger problems further forward. But I think probably the other standout case where the rudder jamming was a major factor in the ship's loss was Hiei. Now, her rudder wasn't directly impacted, but I believe it was San Francisco's shells completely wrecked her steering mechanisms, which left her rudder jammed, leaving her to go in circles, because Hiei, while very badly shot up, could in theory have been towed off, and indeed Kirishima did try to tow her off, but the jammed rudder meant she just went round in circles, so Kirishima had to cut the line, and thus Hiei was left to the tender mercies of the Cactus Air Force the following morning. Whereas if the steering motors hadn't been destroyed, and thus the rudder hadn't been jammed, or the rudder could in some other way have been straightened or cut loose, then there is a reasonable possibility that Hiei could have been towed clear of the battle area. Now, whether or not she would have then been ambushed by a submarine or something on the way home is another matter, but it certainly contributed very much to her loss in the manner that she was actually lost. Kra F1 asks, in current times, the absolute top speed of warships is usually classified. In the past, did navies ever hide or misrepresent the actual top speeds of their ships? And if so, was there a reason beyond just general secrecy? Very occasionally it would happen, but not that often. In part because very often there were either penalty clauses associated with a ship that didn't manage to reach its designed top speed, or there could be reward clauses if it exceeded its top speed, or a mixture of both. And thus the manufacturers of the ships were very keen to have it publicly stated that the ship had matched or exceeded its planned design speed, which of course was a known public matter, because, well, if that wasn't known, then they were open to having money taken off of them, or money not awarded to them. Now, things did change somewhat during wartime. So, for example, during the First World War, you wouldn't necessarily openly advertise how fast your ships could go, because if you did, that could allow your enemy to start making considerations for countering them, and also gave them a good starting point for estimating the actual capabilities of your ship. Because obviously from an external inspection, things like the armament, they're not really worth hiding because it's very obvious what those guns generally are. But things like how much protection a ship has and how fast it is are both related, because obviously a certain amount of speed needs a certain amount of machinery, which takes up a certain amount of weight, and you can make approximate estimates on the total displacement of a ship based on its external appearance and estimates based on its armament. So if you don't tell people how fast your ship is, then A, they might get the wrong end of the stick and design a ship to counter a vessel which is completely different to the one you're actually building. They might get panicked, as the British sometimes did, and think you're going a lot faster than you actually are. Or they might make a critical mistake, because if they think, well, let's say you design a ship that's going to do 28 knots, and someone thinks, oh no, this ship's going to do 33, they're going to look at it and they're going to go, okay, right, well, if we know it's this heavily armed and we think we know it's going to go at 33 knots, well, that's going to require this much space and this much weight for the machinery, at which point you are left with only a certain amount of weight left for the armor protection, and therefore this ship can only be this well protected, and if it's only this well protected, then we can counter it with ships with this kind of gun. And if that estimate turns out to be wrong, because then they put too light a gun weight on the ships they're designing to counter, or they send lighter ships against you, then they plink their shells off your armor, and then you return fire, and oh look, you've won. So plenty of good reasons to hide these things in wartime. Of course, you might argue that a similar kind of argument could be made for peacetime, but, well, in the interwar period, you've got treaties to obey. But also, more generally in peacetime, ships will be going around in public often enough that these kind of details will come out pretty soon, so it's not really worth hiding them. Whereas in wartime, at least, even an advantage of a few months is a good advantage, and it's much easier to hide these ships' activities. Marlin Stout asks, in Drydock 391, you mentioned the possibility of Japan capturing Hornet, repairing her, and putting her into service, and the amount of damage they might have done with her. My question is, how much damage could they actually have done, especially if it was late 43 by the time she was repaired? Given the pilot supply issues they were having by that point in the war, would another fleet carrier, even one as hard to sink as a Yorktown, actually have been able to do all that much damage, since a carrier can only be so well armed and so effective as her air group? Well, as you go on to note in the rest of the question, there's a whole slew of additional things that you get if you capture Hornet. So you get access to the anti-aircraft guns aboard Hornet, so Japan might actually start producing something that is actually useful at knocking aircraft out of the sky, rather than just notifying everybody that there are aircraft around. Also, of course, Hornet has radar. That gives Japan a bit of a kickstart in that respect. There will still be some aircraft aboard Hornet, particularly when you're looking at things like powerful engines. So, pick up a Wildcat or two and you go, oh, okay, so this is how you build a really powerful aircraft engine, and suddenly the Zero gets a whole lot deadlier. Plus all sorts of other fun technologies aboard Hornet. So it's not just Hornet, it's what you get from Hornet that you can then replicate and deploy against the over the rest of the Japanese fleet, which increases the effectiveness of every single surviving Japanese carrier. But you've also got the fact that Japan has this rather annoying habit, if you're looking at it from a purely utilitarian perspective, of regenerating their air groups, and then just at the point where they might start to become useful, they send their air groups off to be land-based squadrons in some kind of attritional air campaign where they all get horribly mangled and it's all back to square one again. Which, yeah, that's not a brilliant strategy. But there is a possibility that if you have both Shikakus coming online by, Shikaku comes out by March 43, Zuikog is not particularly heavily damaged, so let's say you expedite repairs on Hornet as well, that would mean by sort of maybe early summer 43, if you really put your back into it, you'd have both Shikakus plus Hornet plus the various ancillary smaller carriers like Kyo and Junyo. And in early summer 1943, US carrier strength is really at kind of rock bottom, because Enterprise is essentially thoroughly worn out and is desperately in need of an overhaul. Saratoga is around. Victorious, aka USS Robin, is with Saratoga to give them a little bit of a boost, but is also about to head home. And while other ships like Essex and Yorktown CV-10 have commissioned, you have the slight problem that, yes, they've commissioned, but they're not really ready for action yet. I mean, Yorktown commissions in April 43. She's still undergoing a shakedown cruise, etc. in early summer 43. Essex technically is in the Pacific, but is still working up. So at that point, you've got basically Saratoga and Essex. It's almost a Hood, Prince of Wales situation, where one is considerably older, the other is literally brand new, still working the various kinks out. And if against that, the Japanese can deploy 3 large fleet carriers plus all their smaller ancillaries, and for the sake of argument, they hold off on sending their regenerated air groups on yet another suicidal attritional land-based campaign, they have an opportunity in the early summer of 43 to actually have a significant, at least hull dominance, and possibly with that many hulls, possibly even numbers dominance, which may allow them, obviously not to win the war, but certainly to push back and do considerable damage, especially if they manage to draw, let's say, an Essex-Saratoga pair into combat, because, hey, well, the US won Midway with 3 Yorktowns versus 4 Kido Butai carriers, and, with Essex being brand new and Saratoga being really big, maybe they're fairly confident they can win a 2v3, and then if the Japanese show up with every flat top they've got, if they manage to win or at least badly damage Saratoga and or Essex, that sets the whole US program back quite considerably more, which buys the Japanese even more breathing room. The Hand of Ray asks, at the Battle of Midway, with the loss of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, if Hiryu and her escort force had withdrawn to rendezvous with Yamamoto instead of launching a second strike on Yorktown, would a renewed attack on Midway with combined surface forces and Hiryu's air group have been feasible? And would Hiryu have been able to make it to Yamamoto's force, i.e. could the battle have been salvaged for the Japanese? Well, a lot of it depends, because if you don't get the second torpedo strike on Yorktown, then Yorktown is technically still kind of operational. I mean, okay, her aircraft will have diverted off to other carriers, but Yorktown's certainly in a much better position to recover herself generally than if she's hit by the second strike. But if Hiryu had recovered her first strike and collected together various random survivors from Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu who might still be airborne, and hightailed it for Yamamoto's forces, then yeah, she probably could have survived, because these strikes were operating towards the edge of US operational range. So if she'd gone, okay, we're just going to strike down all the strike aircraft, put up an even denser combat air patrol, and run, it's possible the American counterstrikes might not find her. And if they do, there's far more fighters around to disrupt those attacks. And in an ideal world, if Hiryu manages to completely pack her hangar and flight deck with a composite air group, then you could have some problems, because although the Americans would be left with 3 carriers still floating, they would only have essentially 1 overstrength air group, because obviously all their torpedo bombers pretty much are gone. The Dauntlesses have actually taken a degree of losses, have the Wildcats. So you'd have the Americans still having an aircraft superiority, but you'd essentially be in a position of both sides having a somewhat overstrength single carrier air group to focus on the other, although obviously with the Americans having more flight decks to land on and an overall slightly larger number of aircraft we just mentioned. So the odds are still stacked in the US's favor, but potentially if Hiryu can then stay under the cover of Yamamoto's force and Yamamoto chooses to advance, then potentially the Hiryu's air group could carry out a subsequent follow-up strike that might put down or badly damage 1 or more of the US carriers. It's still quite a difficult uphill struggle, because of course the Americans can counterattack, and they can counterattack, and essentially what would have to happen is Hiryu would have to knock out or badly damage at least 2 of the 3 American ships, the American carriers that is, whilst at that point at least 2 American counterstrikes would have to fail to do anything to her, and American anti-aircraft and fighter defences would have to fail to meaningfully attrit away her limited stocks of aircraft. Now, while there is a non-zero percentage chance that that could happen, especially if Hiryu is under the combined anti-aircraft defences of the entire combined surface fleet, it's a long odds. So if the Japanese recover out Hiryu, and maybe once she's under the cover of Yamaguchi, she gets off a delayed second strike that damages Yorktown to the point that the Japanese sub can finish her off, they could perhaps salvage Midway somewhat compared to what it was, because they'd still come back with Hiryu and a few more of their aircraft, but it would be exceptionally long odds for them to actually succeed in attacking Midway. Trigfer asks, was there a system similar to parole for use with cruiser rules in naval warfare? It seems like without an option like this, a cruiser, raider, or submarine captain could be forced to choose between putting their side at a disadvantage by potentially allowing valuable enemy personnel to return to the fight, or committing a war crime by sinking them all. If they managed to stop an unescorted troopship, for instance, they could follow the rules and allow everyone to evacuate, and there's a high possibility that many of the soldiers would be rescued and subsequently returned to the fight, or they could put a prize crew aboard and risk the ship being recaptured with the same result. Alternatively, they could sink the ship without warning and order an evacuation and then murder them in the lifeboats, committing a war crime but saving many of their own soldiers and potentially altering the course of a battle or war. Yes, there was a system in place and actually used parole rules in part, and that was the system of the cartel. And so a cartel, rather than being a drug smuggling gang as it's used today, in naval terms, a cartel is generally held to be a ship which has been captured by one or the other side, but because they don't want to have to hold on to that ship, they don't want to have to feed and clothe and maintain all the prisoners, or they can't for whatever reason, then they can appoint the ship as a cartel. Now, it is their ship, they have captured it, but under international rules of warfare, and obviously all of this assumes that your opponent is going to abide by the international rules of warfare, but assuming that that is the case, then you can send the cartel ship with the prisoners from that ship and potentially any other prisoners you might have captured belonging to the other side, and that ship will then sail to the enemy port. So to avoid confusion, let's say that a British cruiser has captured a German troop ship on the high seas for some reason. Let's say it's World War I, and perhaps the Germans stuck a bunch of troops on an ocean liner and they tried to make a run back to Germany to obviously get them into the war, and that failed because British cruisers found it. Okay, well, a British cruiser can't carry the possibly several thousand people aboard that ship, and it may have also picked up a couple of hundred additional prisoners from various other ships that it's captured along the way, other German ships trying to run the blockade. So, under the international rules of cruiser warfare, what they can do is say, right, well, we've captured you fair and square, but we're going to make this ship into a cartel. So we put a small prize crew aboard, we put the other prisoners we've captured aboard, and then the whole thing gets sent to a German port, and by flying a cartel flag, the other British ships in the blockade will see it come through, they'll let it go through, the cartel arrives at the friendly destination for its troops, and they announce, hey, we're a cartel, we have all these prisoners aboard, they're German prisoners obviously, they're being released back to Germany under the terms of parole, so they're not allowed to take further hostile action against the British for the duration of the conflict, and the Germans are legally obligated to release the cartel ship back into the hands of the prize crew and allow it to sail away, and it is immune from recapture while it's on its return voyage. So that troopship could potentially sail to a British port and then obviously be declared a prize, and at that point, if it sails again, obviously now under British flag, then obviously it's liable to recapture if the Germans have surface raiders out there, but up until that point, it is essentially treated as a neutral vessel. And you see this system for use in the Age of Sail quite a bit. So, for example, in the War of 1812, with American frigates out there doing merchant raiding, or in the broader Napoleonic Wars with mostly British frigates doing said raiding, occasionally, they'll capture a dozen ships and then they'll look around and go, okay, we've got far too many prisoners. We captured the 13th, right? All the prisoners on the 13th ship, and you're going back to your home port, but under terms of parole, and the ship is a cartel, and the ship comes back. And once a ship is declared a cartel, well, as troops you are going home, but also the declaration of the cartel is a formal agreement under the rules of war, which means, yes, technically speaking, if you're talking about a troop ship, you could rise up, take the ship back from the prize crew and sail off, but you'd be so abrogating the rules of warfare at sea that at that point, not only would the ship be liable to be sunk, which obviously in the situation of, say, when the enemy has a blockade right outside your ports, it'd be a very stupid thing to do because now you can't get home. But also in any subsequent cases, then technically by the letter of the law, if you've shown perfidy and an intention not to follow the rules of war, technically the next troop ship that your enemy captures, they can just blow out of the water, and it wouldn't actually be a war crime because if you're not following the rules of war, the other side isn't obligated to follow them either, at least for most of the period the channel covers. Now, obviously, it would be a complete massacre, and most captains probably wouldn't do it, but they would technically have the option. Arglebargle the Fourth asks, in Drydock 309 you were discussing questionable decisions made by the British Admiralty, and you mentioned one incident in particular from the 20s where they had done away with voice radios for a time. I'd never heard about this one before, and when I attempted to find out more I was not able to locate any further information. Could you please elaborate on what happened and how long this lasted until someone finally came back to their senses? Yes, so this was actually mentioned in Admiral Cunningham's autobiography because at the time, late World War I and early 1920s, he was a destroyer commander. And he notes in his autobiography that at that time, there was a deployment of voice radio in the destroyer flotillas, which he found very useful. And this is backed up when you look at the history of the development of radio. The vacuum tube technology that is needed for the development of voice radio at the time was actually gradually developed during the course of World War I and then deployed by both the Army and the Navy. However, as Cunningham goes on to relate, it was then removed because, in his view, some of the higher-ups didn't like the fact that the various ships were essentially chatting with each other as opposed to using the Morse code radio transmitters wherein everything had to be written down and therefore was logged and therefore much easier to trace. Whereas obviously if someone just has a chat with someone over a voice radio, unless you've got somebody standing next to you writing everything down as they hear it, then there isn't any official record of it. So although those voice systems were removed, and then as you go on through the 20s and 30s, you actually see very little in the way of voice radio aboard Royal Navy ships. There is a little bit of voice radio for aircraft talking to their carriers, which is just as well. But outside of that, it's actually not until the Second World War that you start to see the widespread reintroduction of voice radio, or as the Americans would call it, talk between ship systems. And that redeployment is actually still ongoing throughout the Second World War. Explicitly Implicit asks, trinitrobenzene, TATB, is an explosive that features legendary insensitivity combined with a good explosive performance. If an efficient synthesis had been discovered sooner, would this substance make an ideal explosive for large caliber armor-piercing shells? In theory, yes. I mean, its explosive detonation velocity is approximately similar to picric acid, shellite, and other related explosives used, for example, in British naval shells. So you're not sacrificing much of anything in the way of power. And as you say, it's essentially inert unless you really kick it up the backside with some kind of primer. So assuming that you can develop a fuse that provides enough force to actually set it off, then yeah, at that point the shells would be extremely safe. Of course, the caveat to that is that in terms of things like magazine safety, it's usually not the shells that are the problem, it's the charges. But it would certainly be a good step, especially when it comes to the reliability of shells. detonating efficiently, but also not detonating when you don't want them to, like, say, before they get through armour and so forth. Eric Van Dooting asks, in your travels to Japan, did you acquire any new source material to support future videos or previously unanswerable Drydock questions? And if so, do you care to tease us with anything? Oh, I picked up a lot of things. I was mainly limited by suitcase space and weight limits in terms of what I could bring back, but I secured a massive tranche of Maru specials, which of various editions that were pretty hard to get outside of Japan. I got a book which is basically some rather clever person in Japan has put together every single known photograph of Yamato in extremely high definition. Well, Yamato Musashi, including a bunch that I'm fairly sure I haven't seen in the West. And that includes all the plans that were recently discovered. What else is there? I found a book that is like Destroyer Captain by Captain Hara, but it's essentially another Japanese captain's story of his time in World War II. From what I've translated so far, I think he was a cruiser captain, which is going to be very interesting. What else? I've got a complete history of the Imperial Japanese Navy submarines, which is a subject that isn't really covered all that well in the West in any single volume. I've got a book that is the sum total of the entirety of Yamato and Musashi's deck logs from the minute they were commissioned to the minute they were sunk. Again, I've not seen that really in any great detail. Another similar-sized book on Japanese aircraft carriers. So the submarines and aircraft carrier ones seem to be kind of the Japanese equivalent of Norman Friedman's US carriers and US submarines, so they should have plenty of rather interesting information. And a whole smattering of other things. One of the things I did notice that was... I mean, it's not annoying, but it was mildly inconvenient for me as someone who doesn't speak Japanese. I found a really, really cool bookshop in Tokyo, which sells basically exclusively vintage military history stuff. And they've got a huge naval section, which is fantastic. And I would love to have taken it all home. However, well, one, money, and two, luggage space. But regardless of that, the other thing that limited my ability to select as many books as I'd like, there was actually a rather interesting, very thick volume on kamikaze operations, which covered all of them, not just the aircraft, but the submarines and the Kai-10 and so forth as well, was that it seems that serious Japanese academic works, and for those of you in Japan, if I completely misread this, feel free to correct me, but it seems serious Japanese academic works come in fairly standard sizes, fairly standard covers, and the covers themselves are not particularly illustrated. You just have essentially the title in Japanese, which does make things a little bit more difficult because, of course, a lot of Western books, reference books these days now come with dust jackets or hardcover prints, which you look at it and you go, well, this is clearly a book about battleships. This is clearly a book about cruisers. This is clearly a book about this particular class of ship. Whereas the Japanese ones are very plain and you have to break out your Google Translate app and go, okay, that, and, well, hope it actually reads things properly, which it very often doesn't. But even if it does, you basically have to manually scan every single book and go, okay, that one's about that, that one's about that, that one's about that. It does slow down your browsing a little bit. Unless another rather fun shop a couple of blocks down from that one, the main one, I just went to the proprietor and used my little pre-written bit of paper that I had stuck on my chest that basically said, summary was, I'm extremely sorry, but I don't speak any Japanese. I'm from the UK. I'm ignorant of Japanese customs. I apologize for any offense I may have already caused. Please forgive me, but I would like your assistance, which he found very amusing. And then just said, Kaigun? And he went, Kaigun. And showed me to an entire bookshelf. I was like, yay, Kaigun, which is Navy, by the way. Matt Kidd asks, in 2026, the world has gone a very long time without naval great powers fighting each other, which creates a lot of uncertainty in the naval powers' capabilities and if the current order of battle makes sense and fits any given nation's doctrine and commitments. And hopefully this is still true at the time this question is answered, fingers crossed. Are there any historical examples of similar situations where great powers had gone a long time without fighting while building up navies that were technologically very different from their last major conflict? I think World War I is probably the ultimate case study for that, because there hadn't been a really major naval war for nearly a century at that point. I mean, you'd had the knockdown, drag-out fight of the Napoleonic Wars, sure, but then if you think about it, in terms of pure great power confrontation, apart from the Russo-Japanese War, there really hadn't been anything. I mean, sure, you'd had the Battle of Lissa, but neither the Italian nor the Austro-Hungarian fleet were particularly large, particularly well led, and, well, the Austro-Hungarian fleet was pretty well led. The Italian one wasn't. And they were kind of cobbled together with ships that in some cases were cutting edge and in other cases were thoroughly obsolete by the standards of the other great power navies, and it was just a single battle. Then you have the Spanish-American War, which was essentially, by numbers and rating, a second-rate navy thoroughly curd-stomping a fifth-rate navy. So not a huge amount was learned out of there. About the closest you got to a major peer-on-peer conflict between the end of the Napoleonic Wars and the start of World War I was the Russo-Japanese War, and even then that was obviously a pre-dreadnought conflict, not involving submarines, and fought at relatively close range. So you had an island nation, Japan, but it was the smaller power overall, fighting a much larger, theoretically larger fleet, but that fleet was fighting over an extreme distance. So when you got to World War I, you had completely the opposite. This island nation was the one with the much larger fleet. Both fleets were massively larger than either the Russian or the Japanese fleets had been. You had the entire new paradigm of long-range gunfire, fire control systems, dreadnoughts, destroyers having evolved out of the torpedo boats, battle cruisers were brand new. A lot of cruiser warfare was actually fairly new because most of the cruisers involved in the Russo-Japanese War had been flavors of armoured cruiser. Now the armoured cruiser was obsolete, and you had the light armoured cruiser / light cruiser. Submarines were an entirely new thing. The use of radio was far, far more advanced. So yeah, even compared to the Russo-Japanese War, World War I was a colossal leap in technology, and in terms of sheer scale and duration, nothing like it had been seen for about a century. Lord Nelson asks, I recently read that in the beginning of the Revolutionary Wars, French naval engineer Jacques Noël Sané constructed Rasé frigates with a 36-pounder main battery. Can you tell us more about this and the presumably extraordinarily heavily armed frigates? Yeah, so these Rasé frigates, they were done for a slightly different reason than the British one. So the initial wave of British Rasé frigates were done because they had 64 gun ships of the line that they didn't think were particularly useful as ships of the line anymore, but were still in pretty good condition. So they rasé them down into heavy 24-pounder frigates. And then later on, they took some 74 gunners that they didn't need particularly anymore, cut them down to 32-pounder Rasé frigates. For the French, though, they, I think, made a slight error in as much as they took some of their oldest 74 gunners and turned them into Rasé frigates, and this seems to reflect in their careers. There also seemed to be some concern with these older 74s about their overall stability, so I suppose, cutting away a bunch of upper work made sense. But there are a total of 6 such vessels converted, 5 of which under Sané at Brest and 1 at Roquefort. So the Roquefort one was the Bore, and that was then renamed to the Agricola. All of them, bar one, were actually renamed. Hercule became Hydre, Diadem became Brutus, Argonaute became Filibustier, Illustre became Sievola, I think, and Brave, just kept her name as was. So they had typically a main gun deck at that point of 28 36-pounders, and then a variety of mostly 12-pounders on the upper deck, with a few obusiers, the French equivalent of carronades, but some would have some 18-pounders and in varying ranges instead of the 12-pounders. But as I say, they don't seem to have done all that much. One of them was at the glorious 1st of June, shortly after being converted. Another one took part in a number of running battles in the Bay of Biscay, but compared to things like the Indefatigable and so forth, which had long and storied careers after being raséed, Brave was converted and then struck 4 years later. 1794 to 1798. Schiavola only lasted 2 years, commissioning in 1794 and then being wrecked at the end of 1796 in a storm. Flibustier was converted again by the beginning of 1794, but taken out of service at the end of 1795, so even shorter time in service than Schiavola. Now, basically, they all come into service in 1794. Brutus is put out of service in 1797, as is Hydra, and Agricola is turned into a hospital hulk in 1796. So they only actually have, on average, about 3-4 years of service before they're either forcibly or otherwise taken back out of service. So obviously, I think probably what happened is just the fact they were very old ships to start with caught up with them. But interestingly, none of them were taken by the British. So I guess that's indicative of either them just staying in port a lot or else not being particularly easy targets one way or the other. We have found the problem, and it isn't ours, asks, during the time the channel covers, there are somewhat disturbing numbers of instances of captains refusing to come to the aid of Allied vessels based on personal enmity or similar flimsy reasons, and in the Battle of Flamborough Head, Landais even fired upon John Paul Jones's ship. How did navies over time evolve to deal with this kind of behaviour, and when was the last time you could have gotten away with not supporting an Allied vessel on the principle of, I hate that guy in particular? Different navies dealt with it in somewhat different ways, because obviously, apart from anything else, different navies at different sizes have issues like this in very different manners. So, for example, if you're the US Navy in the first half of the 19th century, it's a very small service, and yes, you are going to have some, therefore, rather vicious interpersonal rivalries, a couple of duels fought ashore, for instance. However, because the Navy is so small, these issues will be very widely known, and it's relatively easy for the superiors to either tell them to knock it off, or if they don't think that's plausible, to at least assign them to different things. Because, let's face it, you're not going to put the entirety of the US Navy, such as it is, in one place at one time. Even the Barbary conflict didn't quite go that far. At which point, if you think, okay, well, these two officers are very capable officers, they just can't stand each other. Okay, well, we'll send him over there, and we'll send him over there, and that's it, case closed. Whereas if you're in a really big navy, like the Royal Navy or the French Navy, the massive network of interpersonal rivalries makes that kind of thing essentially impractical. But for some navies, the resolution came simply through the increasing professionalization of the service, where you were more and more expected to put personal enmity behind you. And in other navies, it came at literally the barrel of a gun. So obviously you have the battle one of the many battles of Toulon, but the one that Admiral Hawke was involved in as a captain, which is one of the big case studies in, subordinate officer not supporting the flag officer because they didn't like them personally. But shortly thereafter, for the Royal Navy, you have the case of Admiral Byng, and regardless of the particular merits of shooting him or not, the fact that he was shot and the fact that it was also included in Royal Navy standing orders from around that time onwards that not doing your utmost in the face of the enemy was a death penalty offence, that kind of did away with a lot of the refusal to support each other, because at that stage, even if you didn't like the other guy, and even if you would rather see him fail, if you sat back, the simple fact that you sat back and therefore weren't doing your utmost in the face of the enemy would see you court-martialed and shot. So yeah, you might completely screw over the other guy's battle plan, but you are going to be executed simply for just not doing anything. And even if the battle goes really well without your involvement, you are still going to be shot. So it kind of gave people encouragement to get fully stuck in. Now, of course, you may not get fully stuck in directly in support of the commanding officer or exactly what his orders were going to be, but if you decided to go it alone, there was a much higher chance of the enemy shooting you. So it kind of forced Royal Navy officers to at least in the heat of combat, abandon most personal grudges simply for their own sake of survival, because you had to engage the enemy or else, and if you were going to engage the enemy, it was better to engage the enemy with the rest of the fleet than on your own. Greb asks, what is the earliest purpose-built German cruiser with 150mm guns, and what's the earliest cruiser that was refitted with 150mm guns? So if you want to go by modern-ish ships, i.e. not ironclads, then actually Germany's very first modern cruiser, the protected cruiser HMS Irene, as seen here, was armed with 150mm guns. So it's there right from the start. They have a bunch of unprotected cruisers with 105s, but they actually post-date the Irene by a couple of years, and she's a mid-1880s vessel. And as far as the oldest cruiser refitted with a 150mm, I believe that's probably the ironclad König Wilhelm from 1865, which had a very long career in various iterations of the German Navy, but at one point was actually reclassified as an armoured cruiser, and among other armament she was refitted with, she was given a single 150mm gun. So I think, technically speaking, she would be the oldest vessel refitted with such a weapon. HMAS Albatross asks, I've seen that the 5.25-inch turrets on the King George V's and Didos were described as both difficult to work in and hard to build in the numbers that were needed for the Royal Navy. What made them so difficult to work in, and why were they so hard to build when they were in such a small calibre? So the building issue came simply from a combination of the British armament industry having been massively run down during the interwar period, combined with the fact that 5.25-inch was the latest in a series of intermediate caliber guns, and it was competing for materials and skilled labour with a whole bunch of other guns that were already fairly well established. So the British already had production lines for the 4-inch, the 4.7-inch, the 4.5-inch, and the 6-inch, and those production lines were already there. So expanding what you already have is somewhat easier than building a whole new production line for a whole new gun from scratch, which was what was having to happen with the 5.25. On top of that, obviously, all those production lines, they were competing for men and material, and, well, the established ones already had a lot of those supply lines in place. Plus, of course, training everybody up to manufacture the new weapon. And then, of course, production happening quite a lot during wartime, relatively speaking. It all adds up here and there to various delays. The other problem, of course, was that the 5.25 was originally in massively high demand. There were even plans at the end of the 1930s to rearm the Hawkins class with 6 twin mountings instead of their 7.5-inch guns, which would have made them very interesting anti-aircraft cruisers. That didn't go through because it was recognised the supply line issues were a major problem. And then, because of the Blitz and the Battle of Britain, a number of 5.25-inch mountings were actually diverted from ships to be emplaced around London as heavy anti-aircraft batteries, which further compounded things. And thus, by the time you got to the actual cruisers and battleships that needed them, the supplies were relatively low. In addition, in terms of being difficult to work in, the single biggest problem, at least to my mind, was the choice of the cylindrical type turret. Now, obviously, you've probably seen 5-inch 38 mounts almost everywhere, but one of the things you'll notice is that they have a essentially square floor plan. Okay, it's a little bit rectangular, but you get the general idea. So you've got the circular barbette, and then you've got this much larger gun house on top, which gives you room to maneuver if you're the gun crew and for all the ammunition and everything to arrive. Whereas this photo, I think, perfectly illustrates the problem. So this is a 5.25-inch mount on, I believe this is a Dido class, in the process of being broken up. So you can see there is the barbette ring around the base, but you can see from the general structure and some of the side plating that's still in place that essentially the cylindrical type turret that's stuck on top is barely larger than the barbette ring. And with a continuous curve, it means there's actually very, very little space. I mean, you can see even without the armour in place, you behind the left-hand gun here, you can see these two chaps are working on dismantling it. And look at how little space there is for them. And that's with the gun forward. Obviously the chap up, at least in the front, couldn't be there in action because the gun would recoil backwards, as you can kind of see is happening with the right-hand gun there. So your working space really is only the little bit between the guns. There's a little bit of a passage off to either side, and the space where you'd be standing back, whereas on a like say on a 5-inch 38 style mount, where the chap further back who's only partially leaning down would be, there would be space for at least another 1 or 2 people next to him. But on a 5.25-inch mount, that space is all cut off by the fact you've just got this curved turret surface. And so it's not only considerably less space to operate in, it's also very cramped space that's difficult to maneuver past each other. And thus the whole thing slows down and it becomes very difficult to utilize them, which is one of the reasons why Vanguard's 5.25-inch mounts were so superior. I mean, yeah, okay, they were much more power operated and trained, which also helped. But simply by adopting the octagonal turrets, you just opened up a bit more floor space for people to work in. Colin Olson asks, the fact that the 5-inch 38 is exactly halfway between the 5-inch 25 and the 5-inch 51 in length never ceases to amuse me. Are there any other notable instances where this kind of hacksaw engineering had such an outstandingly successful result? And what are some of your favourite instances of this? I do like the term hacksaw engineering, and the 5-inch 38 almost is a literal example of that. It's almost an Alexander the Great versus Gordian knot situation where everyone's arguing and someone literally just gets a hacksaw and goes, here's a submarine gun with a long barrel. Saw, 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 saw. There is your dual-purpose gun. Thank you very much. Other kind of thrown together weapons that ended up being outstandingly successful. The 15-inch 42, as found on almost every British capital ship in the Second World War, was a phenomenal rush job. You know, given that it's a major piece of heavy naval artillery in a caliber that the Royal Navy had never tried before and is going to go on its latest and greatest super dreadnoughts, the sheer speed at which the program is thrown together, essentially taking the 13-inch 45 and going, well, what happens if we upscale it a little bit? It should not have worked. That's the kind of last minute you forgot to do any of the assignment for the entire year and it's the day before the presentation kind of job. And somehow it ends up being one of the most successful guns of pretty much any time period. I mean, technically speaking, you could call the Type 21 and Type 23 U-boats an example, because Germany goes on for years and years and years trying to make the Walther engine submarines work, and then some bright spark just goes, okay, stop, take the hydrogen peroxide away, I'm just going to take the Type 18 hull, and I'm just going to stuff the lower hull completely full with batteries, and now we have a sub, which is almost the entire extent of the design process of the Type 21. And, it's a pretty good sub when you can actually get the various people building the modules to actually build them all to the right specifications. But once it's in the water, it's actually very effective. And although it was forced on them somewhat by circumstance, you've got to admire the construction process of the Richelieu and some of the Dunkirks, where the French are sitting there going, yes, well, we would like to build this nice, long, sleek capital ship. We don't actually have the shipbuilding resources to do so because the slipways are too short. And then some Frenchman, presumably having just come back in from a visit to the boulangerie, is just like, aha. But what if we didn't build the entire ship there? And everyone's going, excuse me, have you been at the morning wine? It's like, no. We build most of the ship there, but we build the bow and the stern elsewhere, and then we launch the ship, and then we bolt the bow and the stern on afterwards. And everyone's going, that's mad enough. It might actually work. And, well, we get some of the best-looking capital ships of all time from that. And, of course, you have the semi-famous invention of the depth charge, where someone just goes, mine can kill dreadnought. Make mine sink. Put hydrostatic pistol in mine. Mine explode underwater. Mine kill submarine. Submarine much smaller than dreadnought. Submarine very dead. Possibly make smaller depth charge. Or not. And that seemed to be the entire thinking behind the development of the depth charge. It actually took quite some persuading and not a few sterns nearly blown off before the Royal Navy was forced to acknowledge that, yes, you could in fact carry more depth charges if you made them slightly smaller and slightly less apocalyptic. And I like to imagine that some child or grandchild of whoever was responsible for that in total was in service to the Royal Navy in the post-World War II environment, because, of course, the first thing the British did when they got their hands on a nuclear bomb was go, what happens if we explode it underwater? For the Americans, it was, okay, we can explode cities with it, and now we'll see what happens if we attack fleets with it. And the Russians were pretty much mostly about attacking cities as well. And you give the British a nuke and they're like, but what if big depth charge? Coneled asks, what do you think are the 3 most notable 1v1 or small fleet engagements where the winning side overcame a seemingly ridiculous firepower disadvantage during the Age of Sail, a bit like Taffy 3 would later do at Samar? Well, of course, Speedy versus El Gamo has to be up there. The sheer size difference between the ships, as well as their broadside weight, massively marks it out as a significant engagement where, in theory, there's no way Speedy should have won, but she did. Cochrane also gets mentioned for another action, and this one's a slightly weirder one in that in 1806 he finds himself in command of the 32-gun Pallas, a frigate. So he's theoretically in a much better position, but he spots some French ships up a river and decides to send the vast majority of his crew. He has a crew of 220. He sends 180 of them off in boats to go and capture those vessels, leaving him with just 40 men on his ship, which is barely enough to keep Pallas moving, let alone anything else. And while he's waiting for the majority of his crew to come back, he runs into 3 French corvettes. Now, while each French corvette is somewhat less heavily armed than him, he's got 32 guns, 2 of the French corvettes have 20 guns, and another has 16. If Pallas was fully crewed, this would not be in this entry. However, Pallas, with only 40 men, can only man 2 to 4 guns. And at this point, the French corvettes have more guns between them than Pallas has crew total. So in any sane world, these 3 corvettes should have just circled Pallas and could have bombarded her very easily, and it would have been game over. Cochrane, however, uses a series of ruses to make it look like Pallas is fully manned, which then spooks the French ships into thinking that it's actually a trap. They run, and of course, as they run, Pallas gives pursuit. And, well, you've only got a couple of bow chasers. Never mind the fact those are probably the only guns you can actually man at this point. Everyone else is busy sailing the ship. So, of course, the bow chasers are happily hammering away. And the French are thinking, oh, no, well, he's pursuing with full sail. He's deployed full sail really quickly. The bow chasers are firing. Clearly, he intends to overhaul us. And as soon as he overhauls us, the broadside's going to rip us apart. And so, over the course of the next hour or so, all 3 French ships run themselves aground rather than be taken, despite the fact that any one of them probably could have taken Pallas if they knew exactly what situation she was in. And then another one would actually be the Second Battle of Cape Finisterre, led by Admiral Hawke. Now, you might look at the initial baseline and think, well, of course the British were going to win. They had 14 ships of the line to the 8 French. However, when you look a little bit closer, things almost completely upend, because the British have 1 heavy ship, the Edinburgh, of 70 guns, and everything else is 64 or 60 gun ships, and in 2 cases actually even 50 gun ships, the vast majority of which have nothing heavier than a 24-pounder aboard, whereas the majority of the French fleet is significantly larger vessels. There's 3 74 gunners, a 70 gunner, and an 80 gunner, all of which obviously have French 36-pounders as their main battery, and usually their secondary battery is also heavier than the British secondary battery. They've got a couple of their own 64s and a captured British 56 there as well, but in a 1-on-1 fight, or even a 2-on-1 fight, the majority of the French ships have significantly heavier firepower than that which the British ships can bring to bear. And it's not a line engagement. The British are gradually overhauling the French. So it's a series of 1v1s or 1v2s. And despite having individually significantly less firepower, through a combination of rapid fire and mobbing, the British managed to pick apart the French line bit by bit and actually end up capturing the vast majority of the French fleet. Whereas if they'd formed a more traditional line of battle, although there would have been more numerous guns in the British force overall, the actual weight of firepower would have heavily favoured the French, and I'd argue in a straight-up line fight the French theoretically should have won. Corvus asks, now, as during World War II, the US Navy has 3 material conditions of readiness, X, Y, and Z, plus DZ for a darkened ship. However, even today, the old phonetic alphabet X-ray, yoke, and zebra are used instead of the modern NATO words X-ray, well, that's the same, Yankee, and Zulu. What might be the reason for this? Now, I don't know for sure because, modern Navy, but perhaps some of you who either have been in the US Navy or are in the US Navy can chime in. But I suspect it's for a couple of reasons. Firstly, Zulu has a number of other military terms, like, for example, Zulu is Greenwich Mean Time. Zulu is also a signal flag. So by keeping it distinct and having zebra instead of Zulu, if someone's woken up all of a sudden and the PA system is saying something zebra, then he's going to go, oh, okay, right. That means we're locking the ship down to maximum watertightness. Whereas if you wake up and it's like, oh, something Zulu? Is there a signal? Are we changing time? Are we announcing something to do with the time? Are we locking the ship up? It avoids confusion. And I would also suspect there's a certain degree of continuity because, again, if you have trained a whole ton of people in, if you wake up to the alarm saying general quarters, set condition zebra, and then you change it arbitrarily to comply with the native phonetic alphabet, an awful lot of those people who are previously trained, it's going to be quite difficult for them to reset their minds to, if they hear set condition Zulu, to go, oh yeah, that's what that means. Okay. And of course, if you don't change it, then that means the next generation get taught zebra, and then you have the same problem of, well, you've got a bunch of people who are trained in zebra who aren't really going to function very well if you suddenly switch over to Zulu, and as well as the usefulness in distinguishing it from other things that use Zulu, as I mentioned, I suspect that's overall why they've kept it. Plus, it means you don't have to reprint a bunch of training manuals and so forth. But again, I welcome the input of those who might have more sort of on-the-coal-face knowledge. Dennis from Houston asks, during the classic age of sail and during the Napoleonic Wars, there were several times that press gangs were used to man Royal Navy ships. Were there any requirements as to who was press ganged, or was it as simple as you happen to have fingers, teeth, and a pulse, welcome to the Royal Navy? Were there any protections against being shanghaied, and if possible, could you provide some examples where someone was protected against being press ganged and truly were brought in accidentally, and then what was done about it, compared to where the Navy knew that a person was protected and they said, well, whatever, you're getting aboard in any case? There were degrees to it all. So, in theory, the press was limited to those above the age of 18 and below the age of 55 who had prior seagoing experience. And that was the general gist of the press gang. Only when crew shortages got particularly acute would the press gangs start to look further afield. Now, obviously, you don't want to take really old people. They're pretty useless when it comes to age of sail shipping, especially if they have no experience at sea. And likewise, the very young have limited uses at sea. Pretty much anyone, who's much below 18 would only ever have use as a midshipman, and the press gang wasn't recruiting for officers. They were recruiting for actual sailors. So, and apart from anything, if you show up to the dockside and you got, 4 14-year-old vagabonds you managed to pick up, the captain's going, well, what the heck am I supposed to do with this lot? It's and probably send you off and let them go. Now, as I said, in times of extreme urgency, they could then also go after people who didn't have a seagoing experience, and they would be brought on board as landsmen, but that was in extremis. Other ways or people who were supposed to be exempt were apprentices, because there was prior claim to their labour from somebody else that they were learning from. And also, if you were a gentleman, so some form of nobility, and it didn't have to be particularly high. You know, a gentleman is technically the lowest rank of nobility. Then if you've ticked either one of those boxes and you had no seagoing experience, you were also exempt. Also, certain trades could be issued with exemptions from being pressed, even if they were related to going to sea, or perhaps not, depending, not a seagoing trade, depending on where you were. And those would generally be respected if the documents were genuine and it was a normal time. However, again, in the case of a national emergency, then a lot of all of that would go out the window. And there are quite a number of examples where people were wrongfully press ganged and managed to then leave the ship. Now, they had to present themselves to the captain and present their case, but it was a known factor. So there was a young gentleman who was press ganged, and not only did he basically show up and prove to the captain, hey, look, well, my social station means you shouldn't have press ganged me. Also, I have no idea what the heck a ship is, and therefore the captain let him go. But he also then sued the press gang members successfully, because he said, look, it should have been very obvious I was not someone who should have been press ganged. More generically, when you look through records of ships being crewed, there's usually a certain number of people who have been press ganged who manage to make a successful case that they are landsmen, they have no idea how to sail, etc. And the captain looks at, total intake and goes, okay, I really don't need a bunch of useless people who have no idea how to sail, and you are technically exempt, so away with you. But in times of extreme need for men, when it was a case of we need to fill out the numbers and we don't really care how we do it, then almost nothing would exempt you from being press ganged if the press gang managed to get a hold of you. Although even in those circumstances, a captain would usually look to get rid of people he viewed as not particularly useful as soon as possible. So one of the practices that was related to the onshore press gang was the fact the Royal Navy had the right to take a certain number of experienced sailors off a merchant ship if they found it heading in home. And one of the caveats to that was that you couldn't leave the merchant ship short-handed, so you would have to replace them with some of your own men. So let's say you're the captain of a ship and you're heading out and you spot an incoming merchantman and you go, right, okay, we, via the press gang, have managed to get 24 people who actually know one end of a rope from another, and a half dozen landsmen, and this one guy who's just complaining all the time and says he's the son of a local squire or whatever. Okay, orders the merchant ship to haul over. Right, we're taking off 7 of your sailors, and here's 7 of our sailors in exchange. And you put the 6 landsmen and the annoying, complaining, whiny person on board, and, well, they have to survive the, couple of hours, maybe couple of days till that ship gets into port, and then they're done. And, well, now you have a bunch of experienced sailors. They may not necessarily be particularly happy to be there, but at least they will keep you alive, hopefully. Christopher Villenfort asks, the handling of shot and powder or shells. This may be a too big a question, so please consider it for a Wednesday video. Okay, well, I will. But he says, I wonder about handling of shot and powder from the early days of cannon to post-World War II. Things like storage, layout, magazines, automation, etc., etc. Yeah, I mean, that pretty much is the subject for a Wednesday video in full at some point, but I will try and speed run it briefly so you've got at least something of an answer pending whenever I can get around to doing that particular thing as a whole video. So, central storage versus distributed. On earlier ships, when you're talking very early age of sail, you would have central storage because, well, the ship is small enough, it makes sense to put all the explosives in one area which you can safely guard, and of course having things like copper-lined magazines, etc., would be somewhat expensive and take a great deal of care, so if you could get away with one, then great. As age of sail ships get larger, you will still have a primary magazine or grand magazine, but you'll then also have smaller subsidiary magazines, because ultimately you look at like HMS Victory, the grand magazine's right up in the bow, several decks down, and, well, if you are manning the upper stern chase guns, having someone run the full length of the ship and down 4 decks to get the next charge is not really practical. So you start to have smaller distributed magazines. And you see that if you go on something like HMS Warrior as well, by that point, while there are still magazines that handle more powder and shot than others, the magazines are getting more and more distributed and less of a grand magazine and subsidiaries. Of course, once you get to ships with distinct turrets, major turrets, then they will have their own independent magazines. The secondaries will still have a collective magazine or magazines, depending on the concentration of the secondary batteries. Moving from the storage area to the guns or the mountings, well, obviously back in the day, in the age of sail, you only really had to worry about moving the charge, because the round was just an inert stone or iron round. It doesn't explode, so you can store those near the guns. Not really a major problem. But the actual charges would be pre-selected into their charge bags in the magazines, and then they would be taken up usually in canisters or cases. You wouldn't have just a powder monkey running around holding a silk bag or canvas bag full of powder. That was very dangerous. And also, you've got to climb up and down ladders and so forth. You need your hands free. So a small carry case that could carry multiple charges and could be slung over the shoulder, over the back, was better. It also meant that if the occasional flying spark or whatever came past, you wouldn't set off those charges. Obviously, as time goes on, the charge becomes a more and more formalized thing. Some charges are in brass cases, some are still in silk bags. And because ships are getting larger, so it's not just the vertical element, it's the horizontal element as well, then you start to see people hoisting the charges. In a small ship like a USS Monitor, for example, you can still pass physically the charges and the shot up from the magazine below, but on something like Warrior, there'll be ropes and chains that will allow you to haul ammunition up, possibly multiple decks, sometimes a single deck and transfer over to another chain fall to haul it up, and that will get you much, much closer. So instead of having to have people run up and down, you'd have people manning these forms of elevation, which will bring the charge up to you, and then you have to run it across to whichever gun you want to use. Automation starts to come in the mid to late 1860s and onwards. So in the early 1860s, the time of the early ironclads, you've still got manually operated chain falls and hand carrying. But as you get towards the end of the 1860s and then on into the 1870s, the sheer size of the guns, and therefore the size of particularly the shot and the shells, not so much the charges, has gotten to a point where human strength is not really adequate for either moving them at all, or at least moving them at any great speed. And so you start to need mechanical assistance to get the things out of their magazines and to the guns. And finally, for this answer, although obviously there's a lot more to go into, when it comes to temporary storage close to mounts, ready-use lockers were very much a thing for smaller guns. So if you're looking at pre-dreadnoughts or even dreadnoughts, their secondary or tertiary batteries very often would have ready-use ammunition, and that's partly because that ammunition tends to be somewhat safer. It tends to be cased rather than bagged, but also those guns are expected to fire quite quickly, and the procedure of bringing shot or shells and charges up from the various magazines may take quite some time, especially because on secondary batteries very often the hoists might be a general shared hoist for multiple secondary guns. You still have to run it along the gun deck. And so if you have a bunch of ready-use charges, you can maintain your rate of fire for the time that you're engaging, and then hopefully you'll be done with that particular phase of the engagement before you run out of ready-use ammo, and then you'd be restocking your ready-use boxes or racks in lulls between gunfire. Obviously, for bigger guns, the risks of the charges detonating are much higher, so in theory, ideally, you would want all of that to be lower down, and of course the rate of fire on the guns is much lower. However, as time goes on, certainly by the time you enter the dreadnought period, there is still at least a perception of a need for accelerated rapid fire, and that leads to various navies storing both charges and shells either directly in the turrets themselves or in the handling chambers immediately below the gun houses. And this is actually far more widespread. People often think, oh, it was just the British battle cruisers who did that. No, the reason Seydlitz went up was in part because of stored charges. But even in World War II, and also in battleships in World War I, you look at either the original plans or the modifications, the plans that were made, and you will see shell storage in the handling chambers, if that particular turret has them, shell storage and charge storage in the gun turrets themselves as well. And it was kind of on a similar basis to the reasoning behind having ready use lockers for the secondary guns. They accepted that this was a major risk, but the idea was that if the cycle of the hoists could maybe bring up a charge and a charge set and a shell every, let's say, 45 seconds, but you can fire once every 25 to 30 seconds, this is a problem. So what they would typically do is, at least in theory, say, okay, well, if we fire in half salvos to get the range, we don't necessarily need to spot the fall of the first set of shells before we fire the next one. We need a lot of data points at a lot of different ranges. So we open fire, we chuck a ton of shells downrange at different ranges to get all our various data points. That means we need a small amount, 8, 10 shells or so, something like this, in immediate close proximity access. And we'll expend all of those getting the range really quickly, and then by the time the enemy's also roughly getting the range, we'll have burned through all that ready use ammo and will be down to just the slightly slower rate of acquisition of ammunition from the hoists, and thus the risk is obviated. Of course, that doesn't always work out, because sometimes those turrets are hit before they've expended all of their ammunition that they're storing there. Or sometimes they might burn through all that ammunition, but then there'll be a lull in the fighting, and they'll think, oh, you know what, might as well restock for another burst of fire, and then the ship gets hit. And as I say, this is actually far more widespread of practice among various navies as you might otherwise think. Jim Smitty asks, pulling again from Mr. O'Hara's book In Passage Perilous, Malta and the Convoy Battles of June 42, on page 24, coming off the defeats in Yugoslavia and Greece in 1941, Churchill ordered the battleship Barham and an old cruiser to be scuttled in Tripoli. This literally made me stop and go, what the beat? Only Cunningham refuses the order and hits Tripoli with naval gunfire instead. Scuttling Barham seems like a major waste of resources given that she was still serviceable. But this is only mentioned in passing as Mr. O'Hara is setting the table for what is to come later in the book. So do you have any more information on this harebrained idea of Churchill? And why was he willing to sink a serviceable, if old, battleship to stop supplies getting into Tripoli? Yeah, if you read Cunningham's autobiography, he has some very strong opinions about this proposal. Churchill, as I've said several times before, is one of these people who is very useful to have as a leader, perhaps also very useful at determining overall grand strategy. You absolutely do not want him getting involved in anything approaching a tactical level of detail, whether it be for a single detail like, are we scuttling a ship, or even, I would say, even at the level of, an operation like Gallipoli, or various other proposals. Keep him at the high level. He's fine. Do not let him near how you're actually going to carry the thing out. Because then it all goes horribly wrong. Now, with that said, and Cunningham actually says, this idea has to have come from someone who has no idea what on earth is going on in the Mediterranean. The Churchill seems weirdly enamoured of block ships, somewhat in the First World War, but certainly in the Second World War, it seems every third suggestion he has for the Navy involves either directly scuttling a major capital unit as a block ship, or putting into an operation where, and if we get badly damaged, we use it as a block ship, is, an important potential secondary outcome. Quite why he's so obsessed with this, I'm not entirely sure, especially considering that he usually nominates ships that otherwise, like you say, would be very useful ongoing. I mean, you have much older ships like Iron Duke and Centurion, and indeed, obviously, Centurion will eventually be used as part of a breakwater at D-Day. They're not that much smaller than a Queen Elizabeth or an R-class. They're much less useful to the Royal Navy, and therefore, if you were going to expend anything as a block ship, use them, or a very battered merchant vessel, or really anything than a fully operational battleship. But that's Churchill for you. Churchill, in this particular case, was essentially saying, well, Tripoli is so important that we don't want the Germans to take supplies into it, and if we physically block it, then they can't. Never mind the fact that if you have an enemy port in enemy hands, yes, putting a block ship in there or block ships will, if everything goes well, disrupt their operations for a while. But if it's in their hands, they can still eventually pick your block ship apart, blow it up, or any number of other things to get it out of the way, or even just dredge a channel around it. I think maybe Churchill looked at the limited success of the Ostend and Zeebrugge raids and somehow thought that if you just ran with making it even bigger, it would somehow be even better. Possibly on the idea that as a battleship, Barham could shoot its way in and continue firing as it perfectly positioned itself. It's not a good idea, but that could be where he got the idea from in the first place. Andre de Coult asks, during the period the channel covers, have there been surface ships with landing bays, such as what USS Tarawa LHA-1 had in the Cold War? And related, did submarines have diver chambers to release and rescue divers when submerged? And if yes, which ships had them and how were they used? So in terms of well decks or well docks, depending on how you want to term it, yes, these things did exist in the Second World War. They were developed by the British. The British passed the design on to the Americans, and the Americans developed what eventually became known as the LSD, or landing ship dock. You can see one of them here, and you can see the rather obvious well deck. There were also a bunch of sort of halfway houses that preceded this. The Japanese and the British both had these, and this was not technically a flooding space like you have on Tarawa and other LHAs later on, but it was a kind of a deep hangar for landing craft, except that on those ships they moved by a little track system and were launched off a small ramp into the sea, and then the ramp obviously would be semi-submerged and they'd be hauled back on board when needed. So it's not a full flooded well deck, but it's most of the way there. But yeah, in World War II, as you can see, they were in use, able to carry over a dozen smaller landing craft, which could then obviously be transported across the sea long distances at high speeds and then kicked out when they needed to get close to the shore to put their men ashore. Now, as far as diver chambers to release and receive divers while submerged, in World War II, I'm not immediately aware of that. I am aware that there were escape chambers that could be flooded and then emptied, and there was diver escape apparatus, and sometimes in World War II submarine operations those were kind of improvised into use. So you would have special forces usually go into the escape chamber with what would normally be submarine escape apparatus designed for if the submarine's stuck on the seabed. And then they would crowd into the escape chamber, it would be flooded, and then they use the escape apparatus to get to the surface, and then off they would swim. I'm not aware, at least immediately, of anyone using that procedure in reverse to get aboard the submarine, in large part because those chambers, obviously, they're designed to be operated from inside the chamber, and if there's nobody inside it, well, they can't really let you get back in. While there were plenty of special forces insertions and retrievals by submarine, that was generally done by the submarine doing something like surface at night covertly and let people off in a slightly more conventional manner. Seb Dove asks, during the First and Second World War, how did marine detachments work amongst the major navies? Thinking more about whether destroyers and cruisers, etc., had attached marine detachments the way that frigates and ships of the line might have had in the Age of Sail. And if they did carry small marine units, what did they do? So yeah, destroyers and cruisers very definitely did have attached marine detachments. Some of very small ships, like corvettes and frigates, sometimes got away without them, but certainly any major fleet combatant with several hundred men on board would have a marine detachment of some description. In the Royal Navy, for example, one of the duties of the Royal Marines traditionally was to man one of the rear turrets. Exactly which one depended, of course, on how many turrets you happened to have at the rear, or guns. If you didn't have a turret, you just had a gun mount. But more generally, obviously, Marines would serve the main purpose of providing shipboard security. They were also often experts in armament, not just small arms, but the ship's guns, so they could help out the gunnery department, hence why on British ships they would very often entirely crew at least one of the guns. In the event of boarding a ship, or being perhaps rarely necessary to counter a boarding expedition or make a landing party, the Marines would be a major part of that as well, and they would usually be in charge of maintaining the ship's supply of small arms and light field artillery. And yes, many ships did carry light field artillery, as well as machine guns and rifles and grenades and all sorts of other fun things like that. Lawson Say asks, what were Admiral Beatty's accomplishments as the First Sea Lord and during his other non-frontline postings? You've mentioned that Beatty was much more adept at administering the fleet ashore than commanding it at sea, but I can't find much information about it online other than him successfully lobbying for funding during the 1920s, which seems to be more indicative of charisma than general administrative prowess. Well, there's two things. Firstly, of course, Beatty ashore, administering the fleet, all he has to do is not lead it into complete and utter annihilation, and he's already doing a better job than he was commanding it at sea. But more generally, he had to oversee the massive downsizing of the Royal Navy in the post-World War environment, and he did manage to make a number of interesting lobbying and admin tasks go in the Navy's favour. And his preferred method seems to be essentially either going way, way over or way, way under what people wanted or what people were asking for, which then let him dictate terms to a certain degree. He wasn't always successful. The RAF kept control of the Fleet Air Arm, for example. But, say, with General Royal Navy strength, he ordered pretty much everything with a 12-inch gun gone. So massively downsized the size of the Navy, but it left them with the core of the 13.5 and 15-inch ships, which are obviously far more useful, and it made it much more difficult for people to argue to get rid of those, because he could say, well, look, we've got rid of so many warships, just don't mention the fact they're pretty obsolete anyway, you can't possibly ask us to get rid of more. Rather than trying to hold on to every single ship. You can say also, look, the savings we made over the last few years, you can't really ask us to now get rid of another class. He was obviously also vital in the negotiating the Washington Naval Treaty, and, well, people's opinions on that might vary, but ultimately the fleet that was left to the Royal Navy, while numerically or tonnage-wise was similar to the US Navy, arguably was actually a superior fleet, because, again, it was an all 13.5 and 15-inch fleet, as opposed to the Americans, who had to retain a fair number of 12-inch ships after the Washington Naval Treaty, which were, combat-wise, arguably quite inferior. And then in other cases, things like sailors' pay, or the designs of the G3s and N3s, and things like this, what he would do is essentially shoot for the moon and argue for absolute maximalist approaches. I need a lot of money, I need the biggest ships that can fit in the existing infrastructure, because we know we can't afford to expand the infrastructure right now, but we need the maximum number of cruisers, because ideally having all of that would be great, but he was also privately fairly aware of the fact that he was never going to get that. But rather than start from I want this and come with a reasonable request, which the government and the Treasury would then cut him down from, he would go in with a very, very high-end estimate and say, no, this is absolutely what the Navy needs. And obviously he could then point to how big the Navy had been in World War I and before World War I as a kind of, well, ideally we want to get back to this position, and this is how we do it. And then the government and the Treasury would come in and be like, oh, no, you can't have that. Okay, fine, well, we'll cut this or we'll cut that. And okay, what about this? This is cheaper. And they'd agree to that because they think they've made a bunch of savings. And in fact, that was roughly the position that the Navy not necessarily wanted to be in, but the position the Navy would settle for being in. And they'd essentially managed to get the government to agree to what the Navy actually wanted at that stage, rather than significant cuts. Obviously, they don't win every fight, but the Royal Navy, for all Beatty's faults doing other stuff, the Royal Navy certainly would have been in a lot worse shape in the mid-1920s had Beatty not leveraged his political connections and a limited degree of admin skill the way that he did. Camino John asks, I'm a little bit behind watching Drydock videos, but on one I recently watched, you answered a question regarding a Japanese mine consisting of 2 warheads attached by a cable. In a similar thought process, did anyone research or deploy a mine-based weapon such that it gets tangled in the rudders or propellers of ships, not to sink them, but to damage them just enough to render the ship less combat effective, thus forcing them to seek repairs? Granted, I recognise that the amount of explosive required to cause harm or the sheer torque that a propeller moving at speed creates might just rip through any light to medium weight wire, rope, chain or cable before an explosion could cause harm anyway, but still. Not as far as I'm aware. And that's simply because, obviously, the objective of a mine is to deal as much damage to an enemy ship as possible. So if you do have a mine, perhaps that, at least in part, works on the principle of a very long cable, which could then get caught up with the ship's propellers. And, a decent thickness of steel cable will completely stuff a ship's propeller's ability to operate. But if such a mine was put into operation, you can absolutely guarantee the first thing someone would have done would be to put an explosive charge on the end, so that once the ship is disabled by, having the wire wrapped around the propeller shaft, the explosive charge then blows the propeller off, or blows the stern open, or blows the rudder off, or jams it, or something like that. The kind of, well, it'll cripple them but not stop them is not really something that they were looking for in a mine, because, well, as I said, the mine is designed to kill the enemy ship. The idea of trailing a bunch of debris so that you could, stuff up somebody's propulsion does seem to occasionally have been tried in extremis when people were being pursued, chuck stuff over the back, hope they hit it kind of stuff. But that's not really planned or any kind of official weapon. That's just taking a chance that you might slow them down. Yokosuka Girls Marine High School training vessel Harakaze asks, could the Japanese, once they entered World War II, have sent a squadron or fleet around Russia and caused trouble for the Russian convoys, which would have been unexpected for the Royal Navy? And if not, why not? And did they have any attempts at plans to sail any ships around Russia to fight alongside the Germans, who could then have resupplied them with fuel or ammo? What sort of small squadron or fleet would you have sent if the Japanese had asked you to send some kind of token but still effective force? The simple answer is no, the Japanese never considered it, and that's simply because while one or two ships did make this passage, this is the reason why I've got the Hilfskreuzer Comet on here, because it's one of the very few ships that did. The key thing is that the ship itself needed to be strengthened to deal with ice, and it needed the assistance of Russian icebreakers to make it through, and of course it had to sail during the summer. Now, given that by the time Japan's involved in the war, the Soviet Union is involved in a war against Germany, if the Japanese turn around and go, oh yeah, hey, Soviet Union, we'd like to borrow some of your icebreakers so we can send a naval squadron all the way around you to go and assist the people you're fighting against, yeah, that ain't going to happen. And while the Japanese do have a few icebreakers of their own, they don't really have anything that's capable of sustaining a passage for even a small squadron going all the way across the Arctic coast of Russia. And to top all that off is, even if they did want to try and risk that, of course, you have a very slow-moving convoy of ships trapped in ice, which is going to just be subject to relentless Russian attacks, because, again, they're not going to let that kind of thing travel over to assist Germany, even if they are notionally neutral between Japan and the Soviet Union for most of the war. Sending a naval reinforcement squadron through what Russia considers to be its backyard definitely is one of the ways to break that neutrality. And on top of that, Japanese ships not really equipped for Arctic conditions. Everyone probably would have frozen to death. And with that said, the Japanese don't really have any warships to spare. I think the only way you might possibly get away with doing some kind of passage through there would be potentially as an alternate route for the cargo and supply submarines. But this would have to be like a hypothetical extension of the war into 46 or 47, because in theory, if you had some kind of cargo-carrying version of an electroboat, so it would be a really big submarine with a lot of underwater endurance, although it's still a diesel-electric, then you could perhaps build it with a couple of small, maybe 14-inch or something like that, torpedo tubes up front, and then it could sail under the ice, because, well, there's no anti-submarine escorts around there, so it doesn't matter if you're pinging away constantly with sonar to make sure that you're under the ice but above the seabed. And then at points when you're beginning to run low on battery power, you could fire a couple of your small torpedoes to blow a hole in the ice if there isn't a natural hole there anyway, and pop up, recharge, and then continue onwards. I mean, it wouldn't be efficient, it wouldn't be pleasant, it would be full of a lot of risks, but you would probably be slightly less risk than you would be on the conventional route all the way around Africa, where the Allies are constantly sinking the cargo submarine efforts. Stuart Cork asks, with famous efforts to locate and document the wrecks of various warships over the decades as technology develops that increases the chances of finding them, I've long wondered if firstly the wreck of HMS Barham was located or just known, and secondly, if not, is there a reason it was not? Being a war grave doesn't seem to count because most wrecks are war graves. As far as I'm aware, no one's actually definitively located the wreck of Barham, and certainly there's no photos or anything like that floating around. Her approximate location is known because, well, where she sank is known, and there's only a limited radius from which she could have drifted down. But she is actually in quite deep water for the Mediterranean, which I think potentially is one of the issues, because you'd have to get a full-on survey ship to go and find it. And the approximate wreck site is just a little bit to the south of one of the busier Mediterranean shipping lanes, which could cause some issues as well. But the other factor is it's not a million miles off the northern coast of Egypt, and for a good chunk of the Cold War, that wasn't a particularly welcoming place to be for, well, almost anybody, really. And even these days, I think it'll be a little bit of an interesting task to just be sitting around that part of the Mediterranean for a prolonged period of time. So between that and the fact that while obviously her destruction is spectacular and very tragic, it doesn't quite have the same sort of name pull as Bismarck or Hood for conflict in the Atlantic and in European waters. And a lot of these exploration units and so forth are also either funded by or American in origin. So, of course, they're going to go more towards the Pacific and look for wrecks there. That's not to say that Barham couldn't be found, but, I mean, the other thing is, well, as the explosion shows, there's probably substantially less of her still around as compared to some other ships. Ed Schaller asks, one of my long-standing concerns with navies in particular, and any rigid hierarchical structure in general, that I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on, is there seem to be plenty of historical examples where flag officers have issues with, as you put it, room temperature IQs. Now, if you're a non-flag officer that cares about your men, are the only choices in dealing with such an officer really just insanity, court-martial, or helping the flag officer get a posthumously awarded Medal of Honor? Do navies train folks for these kind of eventualities, or does everyone just get told to have blind belief in flag officers and hope that their IQ at least approaches the temperature of boiling water? Well, one of the tried and tested methods, if at all you can pull it off, that I've heard from various people, both currently living and in historical accounts, is you do your level best to work around them. Because most such officers are more interested in everything going well so that they can claim credit for it, regardless of whether it's actually deserved credit or not, so that they can continue meandering along life's path and hopefully not killing too many people incidentally along the way. And I think someone summed this up to me in the following ways. They said, imagine a 2x2 grid. So on one axis, you have smart and dumb. And on the other axis, you have lazy and active. And he said, well, if you get a active, smart officer, great, because they'll probably actually improve things and do a lot of the work for you. This is from an NCO's perspective. If you get a smart and lazy officer, then that can be even better, because a smart and lazy officer will probably just let you get on with doing things, which means more work for you, but on the other hand, you get to do things the way you want it to be. If you get a dumb and lazy officer, then you can just do things and they're never going to notice, at which point, again, you're kind of running the show, but at least it gets run properly. The thing you really, really, really don't want to run into is an active but dumb officer, because they will insist on sticking their nose in everywhere where it doesn't belong and break everything because they genuinely don't know what they're doing. At which point, he said the best thing to do with a active but dumb officer is to do the metaphorical equivalent of finding a ball or a stick and throwing it as far away from you as humanly possible to distract them, and while they go off doing that, then you can actually get on with the real work. So essentially, if your senior officer is perhaps a few fries short of a Happy Meal, if they are also lazy, then just do stuff out of sight, and as long as everything keeps ticking on, you're probably not going to have to worry about things too much. But if you've got one of those rare ones who's both thick as two short planks, but also thinks that they're the second coming of Sun Tzu, transfer. Kirsten Darkin asks, I was rewatching your explanation on the design and construction of battleship guns and was intrigued on the discussion between elastic and plastic deformation. I was wondering, in what form does the temporary changes in elastic deformation most significantly appear? Bore diameter changes, barrel straightness, or something else? And how much elastic deformation would be expected in the course of normal firing? How did the different materials and construction methods impact this, and was deformation entirely elastic, or did normal firing also include a small amount of plastic deformation? And how much did normal deformation contribute to wear on the gun itself? So, deformation in things like guns is one of those slightly odd things in that theoretically you don't want it to happen at all, but you also definitely do want it to happen to avoid absolute disaster. And the reason for that is actually all to do with distribution of force over time. Because in theory, to maintain perfect accuracy and to, have everything work exactly as you want, you would want a perfectly rigid body, because then the gun barrel doesn't droop, it doesn't expand, it doesn't wobble, it does nothing. You fire the gun, the shell goes dead straight exactly where you aimed it. The problem is that if you have a perfectly rigid material, and you impact that material with some kind of force, then when that force, whether it be a pressure wave, a shock wave, hitting it with a hammer, whatever, impacts the thing in question, it could be a surface, a mass, or whatever, that force essentially acts near enough instantaneously, which means that given that an awful lot of force and energy equations include a time factor, a relatively small impact can result in a massive immediate force, which can result in things shattering and shearing and going all haywire. So, for example, something like glass. Glass is actually a very hard material, but it's also very rigid, very brittle, and so if you put a relatively small shock in it, it just tends to break and shatter. So let's say, for example, if you take a really small firecracker and you stuff it in, say, a champagne flute. Now, a champagne flute is much, much, much harder, much, much, much more rigid than, say, clay. But stuff a firecracker in a champagne flute, maybe put a weighted coaster on top, and that champagne flute's going to be turned into a billion shards of flying shrapnel the minute the thing goes off. If you then make a faux champagne flute out of wet clay and do the same thing, you might get a little tear in it, but it might also just bulge. So it's physically intact, but has deformed quite a bit, as opposed to the glass one, which didn't deform, it just shattered. It just gave up the ghost. And it's the same thing with artillery. If you make your gun too rigid, you run the risk of cracks or explosions. But obviously, if you make it too deformable, too flexible, then you're never going to get any accuracy out of the thing. So there is a balance point in there, but it's a very difficult one to achieve. And also, things will change depending on how you're firing the gun. So you fire the gun for the first time, and you may not get a huge amount of barrel droop. If you fire the gun once every half hour, you're probably not going to get a substantial amount of barrel droop. But if you're firing the gun, let's say it's a 6-inch gun, and you're firing it once every 5 to 10 seconds for half an hour on end, and it heats up, or a battleship gun once every 20 to 30 seconds for half an hour on end, and it's heating and heating and heating, obviously as the metal becomes hotter, it becomes softer, and you're going to start getting the barrel drooping more and more and more. And yeah, the largest amount of deformation that you're going to see on a gun barrel when it's firing is going to be along its length. So this can sometimes be in the form of whipping, or in the form of droop, or in the form of both. And that's partly because it's a very long axis for the force to act on. And of course, if you're near the front of the barrel, you're many, many meters or feet or yards away from where it's actually supported, and therefore, thanks to the law of moments, the forces exerted are also quite high. So in those areas, you're going to have, if you had a really, 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 really high-speed film, you would have a deformation that would be experienced in, a visible spectrum. So we'd be talking millimeters. Whereas bore diameter theoretically does expand very slightly, but that would be a very, very slight, because obviously you don't want a bulge essentially following the shell up the barrel, although technically on a micron scale that is in fact what happens. But if it happens on anything particularly larger than that, you'll end up with a substantial portion of the propellant gases coming past the shell destabilizing, and all sorts of other things that really aren't good, which is why the inner liner, well, one of the reasons why the inner liner of a gun barrel is very, 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 very hard to stop that, and the outer layers are somewhat more ductile and exist to basically stop it shattering like glass, like we mentioned at the beginning. And when you're throwing these kind of energies around, theoretically, you want any deformation that occurs to be elastic, because then obviously it will return to its original form. But at the kind of energies you're dealing with, certainly at battleship scale, there is going to be a slight amount of plastic deformation at times. Sometimes because you run the gun too hot, sometimes because of environmental conditions, sometimes because of the angle. It can even be really silly stuff like you fired the gun and it's really hot, and then you take some water green over the bow and the guns were pointing out to starboard, and all the starboard sides, which are obviously facing forward, of the guns get rapidly cooled by the seawater and you get warping. Again, it could be very slight, but it is there. So broadly speaking, you want your gun to suffer just plastic deformation, but you will suffer some elastic deformation. Whether or not that's enough to actually significantly compromise the gun's operational capabilities before it reaches the end of its service career is largely down to the circumstances in which that deformation is taking place. The Past is Another Country asks, having rewatched your Guadalcanal series, supply was a problem for both sides. The Japanese attempted to solve this by pressing warships into the fast transport role, usually with poor results. The Germans' use of Blücher as a part transport in the invasion of Norway didn't work out too well either. Were there any attempts to build fast transports or convert warships into fast transports, like taking an older cruiser, removing the aft armament section, and installing material handling equipment? Mostly thinking about the last-mile transport of critical materials and personnel in contested areas, like from Gibraltar to Malta. How would you go about building or converting a ship into a fast transport? One of the big problems ideas like that faced was that there were fast transport ships, but they tended to come in two flavours. One was they were fast for transport ships, i.e. they were able to go in the low 20s of knots, which still wasn't particularly fast by warship standards, or they were genuinely fast, but they tended to be very big, ocean liners and such, which, one, weren't particularly well equipped for handling bulk cargo very quickly, and two, tended to be roped in as troop transports and were far more valuable in that role. So building a dedicated fast, as in 25 knot plus, transport ship for, inserting supplies under enemy fire was a little bit of an ask, because in a commercial environment, between the wars, there wasn't really any substantial demand for such a vessel, whereas once you've got into the war itself, it's a bit late to be building something that large and that specialized. Now, as I say, that doesn't stop people building what are termed fast transports, but that, as I said, generally means they're just faster than the average transport, which has essentially just a few knots speed advantage over regular ones. So instead of speed in the tens of knots, it's speed in the low 20s. But sort of converting some warships into fast transports was attempted at various points. One of the more successful attempts was the reason this picture is up. This is HMS Abdiel of the Abdiel class mine layers. And the reason these were very successful is because they were ridiculously fast, and in that rather nice category of size where they were bigger than the average destroyer, so they had more internal volume, but not so big that, like a cruiser or something, they were a very obvious target. They could also be disguised, particularly in the Mediterranean, as French contre-torpilleurs, and because they were mine layers, they had massive internal spaces for, relative to their size, for the carriage of mines, and those obviously could be very quickly repurposed for the carriage of cargo. And funny you should mention the journey from Gibraltar to Malta. This is exactly what they did sometimes, running supplies at extremely high speed into Malta and then unloading them. And this is the other thing. I think if you're going to use a fast transport, assuming that you're going to be doing this either under fire or under potential threat of enemy fire, your fast transport can't actually be that big, because you've got to be able to offload everything quickly, say under the cover of night. And that doesn't mean you've got all night to do it. And it's just a case of you've got to run in, use the early part of the night, evening, early night, as cover for your run-in. Then the central part of the night, so maybe 3 or 4 hours, that's your unloading time, because then the early morning, say from 2 a.m. onwards, is the time you need to use your high speed to get back out of range. And at that point, something like the Abdiel's, sort of 2.5, 3.5, 4,000 ton, very high speed vessel is probably, for that kind of almost covert supply insertion, about the ideal. Anything smaller, and you probably can't carry enough cargo to make it worthwhile. Anything larger, and it's far too obvious of a target and probably far too valuable in other uses. Felicity Longis asks, it's sometimes mentioned how the living conditions aboard Japanese submarines were among the worst a sailor could have had to endure throughout World War II. Could you elaborate on this? It's my understanding that Japanese submarines tended to be fairly sizable, at least enough that crews presumably had somewhat more living space than some other contemporary ocean-going attack subs. Was it a result of institutional neglect of the submarine arm resulting in declining quality of life standards, a particular culture within the submarine arm leading to difficult living conditions, or something else? So it essentially comes down to a few things. Firstly, the living conditions aboard submarines of pretty much any fleet were generally some of the worst in that fleet, because of the restrictions imposed by, living in a submarine as opposed to a ship that could have open air. And the Japanese Navy generally was not particularly known for its creature comforts. And so you combine, one of the lowest standards of living in any of the World War II navies with the fact you're in a submarine, and all of a sudden things are going to go quite badly. Now, yes, some of the Japanese submarines were quite large. However, that doesn't necessarily translate into greater crew comfort. So, for example, if you look at, say, a Gato class. Now, a Gato class is a pretty large submarine as far as the Allies are concerned. And that thing has a crew of approximately 60 people. Now, you look at a Japanese submarine, say, for example, a B-1 type submarine. Yes, it displaces significantly more, but it is actually faster. So it's also got, much bigger motors and diesels, which obviously are going to take up space. It's got more range, which means it's carrying a huge amount of fuel in fuel tanks. It's got deck guns. Again, it's got a deck gun, not really much else there looking there, but it's also generally, most of the big Japanese submarines would be carrying some kind of float plane. Now, of course, the plane itself would be in this hangar, as you can see here on I-15 up front, but that means you've got spares and other equipment and so forth that are going to have to find a home somewhere in the submarine. They've got a heavy torpedo armament with a fair number of torpedoes, so that's going to take up space. So the machinery spaces, the fuel, the armament, all of this is taking up quite a lot of space, which is obviously cutting into the amount of space you've got available for the actual men. And all things told, it's not that, the B1 that is, it's not that much bigger than a Gato. It's about 3 foot wider, and some of that is casing rather than the pressure hull. And it's not much more than about 40 foot longer, which isn't really going to make up for the fact, apart from all these other things crowding in on that space, you've also got the fact that, as we said, the Gator has about 60 men, and a Type B1 has about 100. So, and 80, 90, 100 men was not uncommon on the big Japanese submarines. So, with the relatively small amount of potential extra internal volume that you've got on a big Japanese sub, that's going to be more than taken up by the fact you've got almost 50% more crew on board, and suddenly the amount of space you have available, even on such a large vessel, has dropped quite dramatically compared to even other submarines. Reichspear Minister asks, could you briefly talk about Chinaware and cutlery on ships, how it became a thing and why, and what was its status until Korea? So, two distinct fields there. Cutlery and your plates, let's say, in earlier ships were personally owned. So people would have them in their sea chests, they would mark them with their own personal marks, and you look at a wreck like that of the Mary Rose, and you'll see that almost all the recovered plates and knives and forks and such that have survived have some kind of personal identifying mark on them. For the lower ranks, these things would generally be made of wood, with the exception of the knives, which would usually be bladed. Maybe some of the other cutlery would be metal as well. But for the higher ranks, certainly in the Tudor period, we know from the items that have been recovered that an awful lot of what was recovered was pewter, so a metal. And the reason why Chinaware in particular took quite a while to become popular on ships is, well, it was relatively rare, so it was a fairly high status thing, and there are going to be a limited number of high status people on board a ship who can even afford it in the first place. And, well, ships move a lot. And one thing that Chinaware really doesn't like is being dropped a lot. So you really, really, really do not want, to be honest, to have China on board if it's expensive and valuable, because it's almost certainly going to end up broken at some point sooner rather than later. Of course, cutlery can be in all sorts of things. It can be in metal, it can be in wood, it can be in bone, a mixture of all of this, it can be in silver. That's a slightly easier way of showing off, because also, these things are much more durable, much easier to store. So a man gets a decent amount of prize money, he might invest in a nice little silverware set for himself to eat with, and a good knife, and those things he can guard and those things he can keep. But Chinaware, while it does gradually infiltrate into the upper echelons of the officers, it's still a very high-risk thing to take with you on a ship, and plates and so forth gradually move over from metal for the rich and wood for the poor to, as you get into areas when these kinds of things are now issued by the ship, they're part of the galley complement rather than people's personal property, you tend to see metal trays used quite a bit. And then, of course, latterly, as you get towards the very end of the period, the channel covers heading into the modern period, plastics as well. But then you will have things like ship's china, ship's dinner services. But even then, a lot of ship's dinner services tend to be fancy silverware and other metals that are far more durable on a ship. Ship's china, unless you're talking about ocean liners and so forth, still remains quite rare. And to be honest, is still very rare even to this day aboard vessels, with the exception of things like really heavy-duty stuff like tea mugs and so forth. Ethan Wilson asks, why didn't we see the same sort of major second-hand warship boom that occurred after the Second World War after the First World War? While I do understand a lot of the older cruisers and pre-dreadnoughts weren't sold, I haven't really understood why some nations didn't get involved in the Great War, and even some that were involved, yet had relatively weak navies, didn't attempt to acquire some relatively new vessels that were only around 10 to 15 years old. Partly, it has to do with where the economies of those various nations were in the aftermath of World War I, but partly it's also to do with the nature of the ships available. So, during the Second World War, the US, and to a certain extent the UK as well, were churning out ships like there was no tomorrow, with the exception possibly of battleships, all the way through the war, in increasingly larger and larger and larger numbers. And that meant that when the war ended and there was the colossal reduction, shall we say, of naval strength, it meant that all the old stuff could very easily go to the breakers. The navies could keep the newest and latest and greatest stuff for themselves. But even once they'd done that, within the realms of the budgets that their various governments were giving them, there was still a bunch of pretty new, relatively unworn shipping that was available. And, of course, with the rise of tensions between the West and the communist bloc, there was a desire to try and essentially bribe people to stay on your side. And also a lot of people that had what naval strength they had prior to the war devastated. So it was kind of a a two birds with one stone situation. So let's say, for example, you've got the Dutch. The Dutch obviously have been invaded, first in the Netherlands and then in the Dutch East Indies. Most of their extant naval strength was destroyed either during those invasions or ABDA command, and they have a very, very few ships left. But with the various sort of potentials of communist governments being elected in Europe, and the fact the Dutch essentially don't have a navy anymore, if the US and Britain step in and say, hey, look, we can help you reestablish your military. Here, have a bunch of ships for a knockdown price, and now you have a navy again, and you can now be our active allies again, and everyone goes, oh, well, look at them, aren't they being so generous? Maybe we should side with them, as opposed to the Soviets, who weren't giving out warships like it was going out of fashion. And as I say, these warships that are being given out are essentially very low mileage ships, so they're going to last a fairly long time, and it also helps with commonality of parts, because in theory, if everyone is broadly allied with each other and they're operating one of relatively few ship types, maintenance and spare parts are kind of somewhat cross-compatible across the board, especially for someone like the US, because the US budget for keeping destroyers around was barely larger than the active production run of gearings, which meant that almost the entire Sumner class and almost the entirety of the Fletcher class were technically surplus to requirements. Now, of course, you would have some in reserve and so forth, but there were loads of Fletchers and Sumners and not a few gearings that had barely a few years of operations on the clock. And, well, it would be a shame to scrap them, but you can give them out like, party favors, and everybody likes you. And now they're kind of beholden to you as well, because, yes, there's a lot of commonality of spare parts, but guess who's the primary supplier? Whereas you cycle back to the First World War, and not only was there not quite the same clear divide and need to rearm lots of various countries, but also, while there had been a big surge of Wicks and Clemson class construction, there hadn't been quite the same level of construction as there was in the Second World War. Admittedly, in part because the First World War didn't last quite as long, but also because there were a lot of tensions which would lead in part to the Washington-Naval Treaty later on, the various big navies were determined to basically hang on to absolutely anything useful. So anything new and modern or low mileage or still somehow magically operational, they were keeping their grubby little mitts on, and basically anything that was going up for scrapping or sale was stuff that was viewed as so horrifically obsolete it wasn't worth keeping, or so horrifically worn it wasn't worth keeping. And other navies, secondary as they might be, didn't really want those. Wyoming Iceberg asks, please excuse if I missed the answer in an earlier video. I've accepted your theory of hood sinking as highly plausible and easily understand your reasoning and explanation from your first video on the subject. You then, some years later, added a supplemental video after other evidence surfaced. Somehow, someway, I missed the point of the second video. Was it a further refinement while sticking to the original thesis, or was it a repudiation of the theory laid out in the first video? Somewhat the first, but also kind of neutral thing. So I'm still of the belief that my original thesis is broadly correct. And in fact, since I did the original, I've become more and more convinced that I can actually narrow down the time window, as in the circumstances of what Hood was doing immediately before and what Hood would have been doing immediately afterwards, to a window of a very, very few seconds where we can establish exactly what Hood was doing at the moment she was destroyed. That's obviously a subject for another video at some point. Now, the testimony from Len West, which is the second video you're referring to, that I put that up not particularly to say one way or the other with regards to my theory, what, oh, look, here's this new stuff, I'm so good, or here's this new stuff, I got it all wrong. I put it up simply because it's new evidence and everybody should hear about it. And then they can make their own judgment calls on it. But my interpretation of the new evidence is that nothing that Len West said was contradictory to my theory, and several things were complementary to my theory, i.e. they agreed with the conclusions that I'd come up with. And so overall, I think that his testimony strengthens my theory with an additional set of witness testimony. Cheddar Bacon asks, in the use of time-fused shells in anti-aircraft fire, how did they take into account the nebulous lag time between the fitting of the fuse, setting it, and then handling the shell into the gun. Well, you've got to bear in mind the fuse doesn't start until the shell is fired. So the time in between, it's not a case of, oh, well, it's going to take us 5 seconds to load this thing, and then it's got 3.5 second flight time, so the fuse setter needs to set an 8.5 second fuse, because otherwise then if there's a delay, the shell's going to go off while it's still in the turret. It would be a case of, at this point in time, we think the shell flight time is going to be approximately this. Now, if you think there is going to be a little bit of a delay because of loading, then the fire control director can try and anticipate where that aircraft is going to be and perhaps shorten the time fuse just a little bit, but it's not going to be by much. But this is why people practice drill. You need to set the fuse, get it into the breach, get the thing off as soon as humanly possible. And hopefully it won't have changed things all that much, because yes, the plane and the shell are both moving relatively quickly, but there is a reasonable amount of error built in there anyway. And as I said, the fuse setter, if it knows that, let's say, drill takes 5 seconds to get it out of the fuse setter into the gun and away, well, you're not going to take 5 seconds off the fuse timing, because in those 5 seconds, the aircraft in question will only have moved a very small amount. And so you maybe only need to take a few fractions of a second off of the shell fusing. So essentially, maybe setting the shell to detonate what it thinks at the time is maybe 100 feet in front of the aircraft, and by the time you actually fire it, it'll be 50 feet in front of the aircraft or something like that. But we're talking about very, very, very minor changes in timing, to the point that for long distance fire, certainly, it probably doesn't actually matter all that much. And finally, Dave asks, what was the opportunity cost for Japan upgunning the Megami class? Could they have built 2 more Tones or boosted the Issei's up to over 27 knots so that they could escort Kaga instead? So, I don't think there's a huge opportunity cost for upgrading the Megamis, because their refits take place in Drydock, and so they're not occupying slipways. So you could be building other stuff on the slipways they were built on, and indeed the Japanese actually were at the time. Likewise, while they are spending time and effort and money on refitting them, Japan, when it's going all out in its naval expansion efforts, is more limited by its infrastructure, especially when it comes to larger vessels. How many slipways do they have? How much heavy lift equipment have they got? As opposed to necessarily manpower or money. I mean, they are hemorrhaging money like there's no tomorrow, but they're prepared to do that if it gets them the fleet that they want or that they think they need. So in the short term, at least, it's not as big of an issue. So you've got the Megamis being refitted. They have some other work done to them while they're in Drydock, additional improvements, bulges, armour, etc., etc. But the guns are being dropped in, and of course the 666s are being taken out, and they can be used elsewhere, like on, say, the Yamato class, or on projected 666-inch cruisers like the Oyoto and Naganos, and all these kinds of things. So there was a fair degree of reuse of stuff that they took off the Megamis. So in terms of equipment sink, it's kind of more of a cost-neutral thing. So, yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say that there was a huge opportunity cost missed. There was obviously expenditure of time, money, and resources, but given what Japan was throwing at its fleet in 1939, 1940, I can't really point to any particular program and say this program was substantially delayed because they decided to do this to the Megamis. And as I said, there would have been some ships that would have required brand new 666-inch turrets and so forth, had that not gone ahead, which would have been more time and money you would have to invest elsewhere. And that brings us to an end for this month's Drydock. Thank you very much for listening, everybody. As you can tell, I've survived coming back from the States, even if Bank of America stole my passport. There's a whole big story to that anyway. So, with that said, thanks for listening, and I'll see you again in another video at some point.